Welcome to the NHK is a 2006 anime by Gonzo, made as an adaptation of the 2002 light novel of the same name by Tatsuhiko Takimoto. It is an adaptation of that said light novel, and not the manga, which ran from late 2003 to 2007 and covered a similar enough story. It has enjoyed a cult following of devoted enjoyers. Its prominence was not that of any of the breakout shows, but that is to be expected of a show without so many of anime's popular expected characteristics. Its cult status, however, has not limited its confusingly demi-popular position among anime fans, as much as it is a cult classic, it also enjoys great feast or famine popularity when someone like, let's say, colossal streamer Ludwig, calls it the best piece of visual media. Welcome to the NHK, as much as it is an anime, casts off a lot of the typical vestiges one would expect. Its premise is concerningly grounded, its tone reflective, and its characters painfully relatable. There are no flashy hair colours, no outstanding abilities, and no fanfare about the events. As much as it is an animated media, its comparisons in its own genre are limited. The idea for this video came about when, discussing media with the Dr. Range server, I noticed that I was the only one to have seen this show. Unsettled, I took on the daunting task of walking people through this wonderful piece of media, like the Moses of melancholy, and in doing so, much like the first, second and third time I'd watched it prior, I had moments of truly drowning in forgotten regret. The show is great at dragging you, alongside the protagonist, Sato, through soul-wrenching catatonic depression. With this said, the self-flagellating task of watching Welcome to the NHK, as its end dawned, reminded me why I had ranked it so highly. The story is rewarding, the messaging salient, and as much as it is undeniably depressing media, it does force you to think about your priorities, your intentions, and your future, which you may have been prior neglecting to do in an appropriately objective manner, even if it is in just the desire to not be like Sato. So, dear viewer, let's wander the streets of Akuta together, as I break down initially the story, then the characters, the background, and finally the future of Welcome to the NHK. If you've not watched the show, I would implore you to do so now. You have been warned. Chapter 1. Explaining the story. Firstly, we will start by getting the story in order. Of course, like any good video with analysis in the title, this video will end up being simply a recantation of events with one or two throwaway platitudes strewn around it. I kid, of course, but I would like to stress that I'm aware of the stereotype, and I'm striving to avoid it. But one cannot make this video without first explaining many of the important story points that need to be ironed out. A large portion of this early section will be dedicated to what is roughly a play-by-play, but it is within the order of events that we find a lot of the tragedy of the show, so I cannot think of a way to structure the video any better while keeping it as a near-exhaustive insight. Welcome to the NHK is largely played straight. Whether or not Sato is actually perceiving something is usually explained at some point, with one notable and controversial exception, and many things are stated in passing which really do deserve more attention. The most sensible way to explain these things is, unfortunately, going through the show's events in order. With my structure justified, let us move on to the content. Puzzle, the show's opening, at first, may seem like harmless fun. At first glance, it looks like it could be based on almost any amount of other contemporaneous anime. Glanced at from over the top of a mobile phone as you wait to get to the show, it seems like typical late teen anime with raunchy aspects, goofy moments, and a cute main girl. What's not to love? Of course, with any amount of attention paid, you'll realize something isn't right. Where someone has already said something better than me, I'll outsource. So here I'd like to direct you to a YouTube video by popular YouTuber Mother's Basement, who did a good job analysing the OP, frame by frame, back in 2015. A link will be in the bibliography, which will probably be in the description, and I thoroughly recommend watching the analysis. If it's not in the description, it is because I am either lazy or incompetent, or it got taken down somehow. The score, however, is something I can comment on. Puzzle has a uniquely mournful tone, suiting the show well, which at first may not be as easy to notice. It's something about the vocalist's tone which, at first, comes across as sleepy or gentle, and when you've heard it enough, comes across as more worn down, tired, and exasperated. Roundtable did a great job on this. From OP1, with those wonderful blaring horns, we get that sort of odd optimism hiding the definitely present sadness, bubbling underneath. And that is not to even comment yet on the work of art of OP2, the hot mix. Puzzle is a wonderful chameleon opening. It becomes the view of Welcome to the NHK that you want to see. You think it's a funny show full of laughs and goofs? Well, here's Sato turning into a frog stopping mid after running off a cliff a la Roadrunner. You want that deeper view of all the characters suffering? A more considered view of any of Mizaki's appearances are outright saddening, and the alternately sleepy or exhausted styling works with that perfectly. After the OP, we open with a fully delusional Sato. We get a brief explanation of what Sato calls the NHK, a string of words which translate to Japanese Shut-In Association. In this, we get a glimpse of what is ultimately the last scene of the show, Sato running off the jetty into the avatar of the NHK holding one of these little guys who is ultimately being used as a grenade. Importantly, and of significance to the source material, we get to see that already Sato is dreaming of a dramatic death. He is targeted, resists, and dies in what is, oddly, a suicide bombing attack on something sharing the name of the public broadcaster. In the end of the light novel, we get the information that Sato, from the start, had been dreaming of not a productive life or any typical trappings, but of dramatic death. And in this scene, the animators convey that, while delivering an entertaining hook into the story, cutting from this into Sato's real, and far less exciting, life. Speaking of, we get the view of Sato's room. It is pertinent to mention that Sato's room is decorated with American movie paraphernalia and the like. Sato, at this point of the show, is not a weeb or otaku. He is a raw shut-in. He is consumed with agoraphobia or something of the like, and has not filled his ample time with dedicated interests, but simply contented himself with burning away that time, exemplified by the fact that he tells us directly that he sleeps for 16 hours a day. We also get the information that Sato's neighbour, later revealed to be high school friend, acquaintance, underclassman, and what have you, Yamazaki, very frequently blares an anime opening. The anime in question is titled Perurin, which Sato contemplates for a moment. He has been irritated by the overwhelming noise of this music for some time. However, when he goes to tell his neighbour to quiet down, he doesn't even make it to the door. This gives us some important information very early on in the show. Sato's will is weaker than his fear of personal quiet suffering, fearing any potential social consequence that could arise. In this situation, he has a pervasive fear of going outside, and the requirement of having to wrestle with that fear to go outside and one door over is enough to convince Sato to live with a nigh constant irritant force. We get some exposition about the origin of this fear. We find that in early college, Sato developed the belief that passerbys on the street were laughing at him, mocking him, and looked down on him whenever he was outside. This is a common enough fear, but Sato's position is quite a bit more severe than the typical manifestation, wherein people focus a little more than accurate on the potentiality of someone or some group looking at them. We get the information that Sato blames the situation on the NHK, and we find that these thoughts were initially seeded by his stoic, attractive, but ultimately mentally ill upperclassman Hitomi. Of course, we can already assume that Sato was somewhat mentally vulnerable, so Sato's avoidant personality, tied with the ramblings constantly around him at the time, expectantly rubbed off on him. The two, in a memory of Hitomi telling Sato that she believes in the 1% of conspiracies that are true, find someone being beaten by middle schoolers, and Sato decides to, in an attempt to impress Hitomi, break up the fight. This leads to him being beaten instead, and Hitomi looks over his beaten face with concern. Sato then rationalizes his conspiracy, as the media conglomerate, named in the light novel but not in the anime for a litany of reasons, pushing out content which attract a specific obsessive relationship to produce otaku, who therefore become shut-ins, who then are virtually at their whim. They consume, they watch, repeat. We get the information that Sato has been supported by his parents in his current lifestyle for almost 4 years now. This sounds outlandish at first, but a child being supported for vast amounts of time and expense is reasonably common over there. Sato, deluded, believes that he has powers from his time as a recluse, and tries to smash a bottle. He succeeds. Amazing! Unfortunately for our Tibetan monk prospect, in his success, he has injured his hand and is now bleeding. This brings him back to reality as his doorbell rings. He worries about the possibility of it being an unpaid electrical bill, which would jeopardize his current living situation, so he wraps his hand and goes to the door. Through his peephole, he sees Mizaki, notably presented first through the distorted fisheye lens Sato sees her through. It is interesting to note that we can assume this is also the style in which Mizaki has been seeing Sato with her telescope. Sato, upon seeing this, calms. He takes the chance of opening the door, which is honestly one of the more outlandish actions the character of Sato does in this episode. This is actually a large moment for Sato, as he takes a chance on this opportune meeting. The door opens. We find out that the quiet Mizaki was not alone, and with blood on his face from his injured hand, Sato has a pamphlet about NEETs, people not in employment, education, or training, sprung upon him, which, foreseeably, Sato perceives as part of the NHK's conspiracy, and is once again consumed by delusion. He denies that he is a shut-in via a long tirade, before a moment of clarity. He says that if a prayer would help, he wouldn't be here, and that they couldn't possibly understand the reasons for being a shut-in since he doesn't even understand himself. After saying this, Sato experiences regret. He has opened up in public, and this causes him anxiety. He panics, retreats into his house, and slams the door shut. He waits but glances from the peephole. Mizaki wonders, seems a little worried, but more than anything, seems interested in the situation. We thusly have the basic setup for the show's character dynamic. Sato then considers his station. He recognizes that not going outside is a negative and considers that he should get a job as to not seem undesirable. This interaction with the woman has given Sato an opportunity to reconsider his life, but even then, we should note that at this point in the show, Sato does not actually want to interact with others, but simply wants to not have the negative perception of others through the mode of a more respectable social station. This is evident by the way that Sato later attempts to impress Misaki with his fictional functionality into leaving him alone. The objective is the perception of being respectable, rather than the human connection based off of that. After some consideration, he decides to apply for a job, considers the ones he cannot do, and ultimately goes to apply to a manga cafe. It is interesting to note that at this point, Sato believes that a job would fill his void, as that is his proposed solution. However, we will later see that his initial and prior desire for a dramatic death persists and is, in fact, stronger. The job has the ability to be distractory and to fill time, but it does not fill purpose. The continual social purpose is a considered one, but Sato's true, raw desired purpose is to die in a notable way. One is the passing respect, the other is a more concrete sense of the I am respectable. A great scene follows where we get to see the withdrawn and consumed Sato walk among the beauty of the city around him. The scenery is pretty, the city lively and clean, yet Sato walks the whole way practicing his application in his head in one of his exceedingly rare voyages to the outside world. The camera, however, lingers on the beauty around him. We see Sato walk across the frame while the camera centers on the beautiful streets, which are modeled after real places. The world therein is not about him, but he is within it. Being said, Sato, however, is totally consumed within himself and his own and others' perception of himself. This comes to a head when Sato finally gets to the manga cafe and has the opportunity to use his recited application. Unfortunately for him, Misaki is the person at the desk, and this immediately sends his anxiety into overdrive. He fails to apply and instead tries to save his social station by stating that he came by motorcycle, but in this conversation even shoots himself in the foot, admitting to never having driven a motorcycle. He had come with the goal of applying, but when given the slightest, and I do mean slightest, resistance, he chooses to try and save the perception of himself instead of trying to better his life. This leads him to retreat to his house once more. He, at home, considers suicide. The embarrassment and the damage to his perception is extremely difficult for Sato to overcome. He talks himself down from suicide through practical considerations before thinking about Misaki and denigrating her chasteness in his mind. This probably made him feel better about his damaged social status, but thankfully, this is interrupted. A knock at the door calls. He goes up to look, and it is Misaki again. He is far slower to answer this time, and this is likely attributable to his perceived hurt image in the eyes of Misaki from his perspective, or confusion as to why this person has returned. This hesitancy, however, leads to Misaki being gone by the time he opens the door, but he finds that she has left a letter written on his dropped resume, inviting him to a therapy course in the park. He doubts the legitimacy of this, but ends up going anyway. Sato considers that this may have been a prank wherein someone is laughing at him, but Misaki does appear, recognizing the shut-in that is Sato, and says that she can help. She says that she has known about him for a long time, which, at first, seems a bit odd, but on a second viewing or otherwise, is quite clearly informing the viewer that Misaki has been spying on Sato right here at the start of the show, and this leads into the outro. The tonal opposite of puzzle, it is raw, disorganized, and harsh. This disequilibrium is much the position that Sato has been thrust into at the end of episode 1, and the outro feels proper given the situation. Puzzle welcomes the viewer back, this time with some more context of what to expect behind it, and the show picks up in the park with Sato being recruited to the therapy. At this point, it is understandable that the viewer could view Misaki as either suspect or altruistic, but largely the latter. So when Sato tries to misrepresent his shut-in status once again to get out of the counselling with a recovered ego, we get a real confirmation that Sato will, given the opportunity, reject the chance to better his situation given a more convenient, low-effort, and honourable sounding alternative. One should not forget that Sato came to the park hoping that Misaki would appear, and she did. However, when that opportunity occurs, he tries to squander it because accepting the negative label of shut-in is impossible for Sato to do. As the night comes to a close, Sato goes to leave, but Misaki tells him that he must come back tomorrow. She will be there, but Sato has to sign a contract for the counselling. We have gained information at this point. Misaki wishes to help the shut-in, which happens to be Sato, but Sato wants to reject the station of shut-in, and therein reject the help for the station in which he is currently wallowing. The reality, however, is evident to everyone who is not Sato. Sato, back at home, has a new conspiracy wherein aliens have trapped him in his home. This is, of course, in the objective of soothing his perception of himself. As ever, it is something else's fault that Sato is a shut-in, and the rest of the world takes joy in his suffering. Similarly, the next day, when he reads the contract given to him by Misaki for the counselling, he finds that it calls him a shut-in, but requires him to go outside each night for said counselling. He considers that such would make him not a shut-in. The corp hits him for a moment as he considers whether or not it is too late to act to better his life at all, before he thinks about Misaki, moving along to the potential negatives that could come to Misaki if he didn't go. But even in this slightest consideration for another person, what eventually convinces Sato to, panicked, run from his house to the park is the possible social repercussions that could come to him if Misaki was assaulted because he didn't show up. It is, once again, the external perception of himself which he has moved to protect, even if it is the bare minimum. Misaki is, predictably, fine, and presents herself as someone who just wants to help Sato with his shut-in issue, and presents him, somewhat playfully, with the reality that he had prior only been going outside in any meaningful way to go to the park on Sunday nights. Sato, offered help, however, refuses to acknowledge this negative trait as, typically, Sato cannot accept the perception. He, instead, says that he has an at-home software job, as a creator. Misaki quite visibly sees through this ruse, but does not particularly push back on his lie. It is assumable that the fragility of Sato's self-perception is evident to Misaki. We are then introduced to Yamazaki, voiced in English by Greg Ayres, who you may know from everything. No, really, you will either already know him from something, or notice him in virtually every other show. Most recently I was Yamazaki jump-scared by Eminence and Shadow via the character Potato. Yamazaki has been Sato's Purin-blasting tormentor. Thusly, we get some backstory for the Literature Club relating to the earlier flashback of Hitomi. As much as the club was named for literature, it was ultimately just a front for Hitomi to talk conspiracies to only Sato. The club comes across Yamazaki being beaten, as in episode 1, and this time Hitomi says that someone should help, and this is what motivates Sato into action. We move from the aggrandized view of the heroics into the realistic. Sato was beaten, but saves the grateful Yamazaki. We see some of Sato's better personality traits through this, even if it is in the pure goal of improving Hitomi's perception of him. For the greater part, Yamazaki at this point feels much of the comedy of the early episodes. The bubble of relative normalcy makes much of Yamazaki's otaku-related talk comical rather than depressing. Horns are still in the intro, and roughly speaking, Sato is happy with his current lifestyle even if he has to justify it with an omnipresent enemy to be convinced that staying inside indefinitely is perfectly reasonable. Sato discovers that Yamazaki is interested in making video games, and finds an opportunity. He will take one of Yamazaki's game design books to fool Misaki into thinking that he works from home. Of course, one of the great ironies is that even if this would convince someone else, Misaki has been looking into Sato's home with a telescope, so all of his acting is in vain, and simply allowed to continue out of Misaki not wanting to scare Sato away. When he tries to fool her in this way, she, as is to be expected, sees through his tomfoolery in an amusing way by giving him an opportunity to prove that he really is a software developer with the question from the textbook. Of course, Sato cannot answer, and Misaki departs, asking him to bring a game that he has made. Yamazaki has overheard the situation, however, and is enraged that he would use his interests to try and fool Misaki. Primarily, it is the deception that enrages Yamazaki. That is his goal, which is being skinwalked after all. Despite this, he offers to make a game with Sato, but finds that Sato has no skills, and thusly, because he was in the literature club, and was the head when Yamazaki joined as the only member, Sato is given the role of scriptwriter, and even this Sato tries to weasel out of, hoping to effectively make Yamazaki do everything and get the benefits of positive perception from Yamazaki's work. Misaki has given Sato a month, and Yamazaki considers what kind of game could be made in such a time frame. Because of their lack of funds, skill, talent, etc., he decides to make an H game. These economic and resource factors be damned, the reason Yamazaki wants to make an H game is that he is, to put it lightly, a body pillow enjoyer, an anime figurine collector, one may say. Sato, upon hearing this, asks into the void for someone to help him. As much as we can consider this to be for comedic purposes, it also gives us some insight into Sato's perception and the ranking of such. Sato has nothing to show as a skill or talent, and produces nothing of note to show Misaki. But even when given an option, albeit one which isn't most respected, views as below his station and rues his situation all the same. His goal of being perceived positively enough to have women leave him alone may, in his mind, require something higher than H-game producer, but he, as a perpetual shut-in, still views it as beneath him. Yamazaki, in an attempt to persuade Sato, tells him of a games company which started in H-games and sprouted off into more normal endeavours. The possibility of a respectable and glamorous life is what sells Sato on the idea. The simple possibility of external respect changed Sato's view of making an H-game from the raw actions of a pervert to something which is a step towards superseding the aesthetic of pervert. Yamazaki lends him some games for research purposes, trademark, and as is a common theme, Yamazaki in such enables Sato's worst behaviours, or is even the outright cause of them. Sato is immediately addicted to the games, and pesters Yamazaki through the night on how to get to the real H content, as, the first time he plays through the game, he gets a more wholesome ending than he would otherwise desire. Throughout the night, he moves from choosing the actions in the game which he thinks would be the best actual choice towards choosing the option which is most likely to acquire erotic content. In this, we see Sato moved from an anxious stupor to an encapsulated addiction. In both cases, he still does not go outside or interact with others. In the pursuit of 2D girls, Sato forgets entirely that he promised Misaki that he would make a game. H Games offered him a world wherein whenever he made a mistake, a regrettable action which harmed his perception, he could go back and try again. He did not have to truly worry about the perception and could act in the goal of outright sexual gratification, which is probably equally unhealthy to being perception absorbed. Yamazaki eventually comes in and breaks him out of this current issue by reminding him of the game, and he's reminded that he has to think of a scenario. This stumps him, and he finally uses the games as a form of research, inspiration or otherwise. He reminisces about the literature club with Hitomi and considers a time wherein she asked him, with bandages around her wrist, whether he would miss her if she committed suicide. Yamazaki, once again, shakes him from his absorption, but this time to show Sato uncensored porn. Rare in Japan because of this small thing called the law. In this, we see Sato's moment of introspection, a moment to actually consider his actions and choices which led to this current point, spoiled by Yamazaki giving him another unwitting addiction to be absorbed by. Absorbed he does become, as he ultimately deletes System 32 to download over 120 gigabytes of porn. Yamazaki has to fix Sato's PC and is ashamed of Sato, declaring, "This is not what normal people do." Sato finally experiences shame. We see his shriveled state as he was not taking care of his appearance, and we get a flashback. Sato considers that he had wanted to be a scholar, a scientist, but somehow he had ended up here. Sato being called a pathetic pervert finally crushed his perception, and he is sent into an episode. He is fully enraptured with the perception Yamazaki presented with and prescribed onto him. And much in a commonly observed, "you think that was bad? No, this is bad" type attitude, Sato demands that Yamazaki takes pictures of him while he tries to capture some creep shots of elementary schoolers. As he reaches his destination with a cautious Yamazaki, he begins to cry while holding a camera, considering the state of his life. But his crushed perception has left him with very few other options for someone who is so absorbed with the views of the outside world. If the perception is already bad, why not just accept it and be the worst? It is around this time that Yamazaki runs away, crying in shame, and Misaki appears, saving him from his plan of ogling children. Misaki asks Sato if he is a lolicon, and Sato immediately returns to his creator persona to try to save his perception in the eyes of Misaki. A breeze, however, ruins this, and he goes to take a picture during the breeze. Misaki simply responds with mild disappointment or disapproval, telling him to not get in trouble because he is, with this event in mind, even better suited for her counselling. With this sentence, Sato has come full loop. Now he has been confronted with the origin of why he started his current path, which led to his addiction, and has been confronted with the requirement of counselling, and Misaki has now seen that firsthand. Sato, in his attempt to be repulsive in order to accept the negative portrayal, and wavering just enough to convince Misaki to continue to help, has only cemented the roles of Sato as the needy and Misaki as the willing helper. He runs away, wondering in horror what is wrong with Misaki to make her not appalled by his actions. Sato, then, back at Mita House, writes a script wherein a figure, imagined as Misaki, is the saviour. Sato's mind gives away that Sato roughly accepts the need for her help and the favourable view of Misaki. He ultimately deletes this, but we see that the interaction with Misaki has shaken Sato from his pornography addiction. He has come around from wanting the immediate gratification to pining over Misaki. The external has, once again, become more desired than the insular world of pornography. Yamazaki tells Sato that making realistic female characters is bad because real women are terrible. The portrayal should be unrealistically idealized, unable to exist in the real world. This causes Sato to write a description of Misaki's behavior towards Sato, inspired by the words Yamazaki had used, and Yamazaki is annoyed by this, because, to him, that description is an unrealistic idealized perception that he could have written himself. Yamazaki makes some archetype suggestions. He suggests the school friend, which, of course, to Sato would be difficult, as Sato's perception of the school friend is largely around Hitomi. And when Yamazaki describes an anime maid, Sato once again imagines a maid that looks somewhat like Hitomi. One may note that Sato cannot help but relate his abstract desires to the real people he knows or knew, whereas Yamazaki's ideal women are women who he does not have to consider the other wants of. Yamazaki ultimately enjoys the veneer of the female, however Sato wants to have a relationship, but is not willing to do anything other than think about actually doing so. We then get a great scene of Sato skipping through an H scene. The woman in the scene declares that she is his senpai, and this has Sato constrained to his regretful memories. He considers the literature club, and remembers asking to just play cards instead of talking about conspiracies, and Hitomi looks over, and informs him that there are some conspiracies that one cannot do a thing about. We know, of course, that at this point, from some later scenes, that Hitomi was interested in Sato romantically, at least at that time and probably currently, and yet, He chose the wrong option in the H game. He chose to try to do the least intensive option, to play cards, instead of pursuing Hitomi at all. Sato, in a tragic line, says, quote, "If it was a game, I could have played that part over and over until I got it right." Unquote. Which, ultimately, I think is a notion which is universal to the human condition and the experience of regret. His state of regret over Hitomi is different. We see, through the flashbacks, that Sato almost tried to engage with Hitomi, but ultimately his attempts were half-hearted and reserved. He had an external image he tried to portray of the aloof, neutral teenager, so whenever he had an option to actually do something, he would usually choose inaction. And when he tries to reach out, for example, in the telescope scene, it is entirely undedicated. His intentions are unwilling to fully engage with the other person, even when the other person is Hitomi. His abject failure to succeed, even when he put in, admittedly minimal, effort, makes his past with Hitomi difficult to romanticize, even for him. Yamazaki once again pulls Sato from his contemplation. He drags Sato outside to find models for the game. We get a walking montage much like the original one of Sato walking to apply for a job, but this time Sato is at least with someone else. Sato is taken to Akihabara, given time to explore a manga store where Sato relapses into H material, buying games and figurines which he tries to talk himself down from, but, as ever, Yamazaki enables his worst behaviours. The fact that nobody around him, including Yamazaki, has any care for their finances, valuing the acquisition of knickknacks over financial safety, convinces him to spend carelessly. For timeline purposes, we see a magazine here marked August of 2006. They go to a cafe and Sato, in a moment of mania, believes he has come up with a good idea by just naming the things around him, and the things he has seen throughout the day. Yamazaki draws a sketch of the things Sato describes, and Sato destroys it. Sato recognizes that the idea is entirely derivative, and has gone too far, and without anyone stopping him, he pulls the social ejector seat of being kicked out of a cafe by flipping a table. After a short chastisement, Yamazaki has to run off to find his wallet, and Sato sits alone at a smoking point. We get similar, contemplative eyes to when he had earlier glazed over during the H-Game Senpai scene, as he gazes over the city. The allure seems to have waned, and reality has reared its head again. He pulls Mizaki's contract from his pocket and thinks. This contemplative moment, as many of contemplative moments go, is interrupted by Hitomi in a chance meeting. Now, Sato is posed with two possible directions. He could attempt to fight regret by pursuing Hitomi, or he could move forward by going to Mizaki's counselling. We get a flashback to the literature club, on what we find out was the last day Hitomi was there. Hitomi waxes that none of the people around them are bad people, but bad things happen to them, so that can only be due to a conspiracy. Hitomi locks the door, disrobes, and verbally regrets doing nothing but play cards as the kettle boils as a nice piece of symbolism over their, shall we say, encounter. Returning to the present, Hitomi offers Sato some mood-altering drugs, revealing that she has 3 doctors and works for the government. She then asks what Sato does, and Sato tells her that he is a shut-in, to which she says that she assumed about as much. He had derived some joy from just being able to reckon with his current situation verbally in front of someone in honest terms. She tells Sato that she still thinks about him, and tells him that as much as he used to talk about his friends, whenever she would see him around, he would be alone. Notably, we see, in this, Hitomi coming to the club room and, with sadness, standing outside the door, gazing in at the real, alone Sato of the time. She then admits to him in plain language that they should have dated, and it's interesting that this is effectively one of the first thoughts she has when considering Sato. Her first statement is of loneliness, regret, and the desire for romance. She says maybe that would have avoided his shut-in disorder, as the camera lingers over the medications on the table. As much as we can visibly see Sato's failings and Sato's regrets' impacts, Hitomi's are lurking below the surface. She has the veneer of success, the real job, the ability to take her friend to a nice restaurant, and so on. But all of this has come at a steep price of Hitomi's mental health. And whether or not Hitomi was very mentally well in the first place, we can assume quite easily that the weight of regret Sato carries when laid onto Hitomi would be catastrophic, so Hitomi is entirely chemically dependent. Sato, contemplative again, stares and considers. We often, when Sato is confronted with reality, hear him come up with some convoluted excuse to protect his self-image and the perception the other person has of him. But since Hitomi is perfectly aware of him and has no perception to fool, he actually has to grapple with the situation. He can only state, quote, "All of this is a conspiracy," unquote. His perception and reality lined up in this moment, for once, and his inaction of the past has caught up with his future. He has been posed with the problem of questioning whether or not that inaction had caused his current predicament and not some external agent. but as Hitomi had said in the flashback, if none of them are bad people, then any bad things that happen to them must be a conspiracy, and not simply chance or failings. In this moment of reality, Sato is forced to be present in that current time, and is at a loss, simply quiet for a good time. His phone rings, and Hitomi has to inform him that it is ringing, because he is either lost in thought or outright catatonic under the weight of his prior failings. It's Yamazaki, and Sato tells her about Yamazaki. Yamazaki joined the club the year after Hitomi left, so whenever we see scenes of Sato and Yamazaki in the literature club, they are alone. It's further interesting to note that as far as that goes, we can assume the club never had more than 2 members. She asks for Sato's cell number and opines on the convenience of the modern day, but says that you still can't buy relationships. Importantly, this scene shows her dissatisfaction with her current relationship this early on. She asks to meet again, and this causes Sato some shock. We immediately warp onto the street. This is important. Moments that are pivotal, shocking, or otherwise large moments for Sato can result in a moment of autopilot, as it were. The absence of information is not the lack of the prior scene happening, as we know this meeting did happen. He contemplates the following events of this later, but only when they become relevant. Largely, we see the show, as per the light novel, from Sato's perspective. In Yamazaki's room later, he is only remembering the events in retrospect, wherein we see that Sato, asked to meet again, pauses, and his hesitancy causes Hitomi to give in and sadly smile, acknowledging that he is, after all, a hikikomori. As she is leaving, however, Sato finally says that he'd like to meet again, but, as is usual with Sato, he waits too long to act. Hitomi wanted to connect with Sato, but his inaction has cost him a definitive response, and Hitomi simply, once again, reminds him that he is a shut-in. Translating to, roughly, "Come after me then, idiot." In the moment, his focus concluded on the object of his desire in the restaurant, another meeting to try to combat his regret, even if he was still tied down by the potential of doing something that he would later regret. This meeting has, further, totally disillusioned Sato with age games in favour of being devoured by regret, and the potential to undo such. He has more perceptibly aligned with reality. He has a chance to pursue Hitomi, who accepts the shut-in Sato, which is an escape from the constant chasing of perception. The presence of other options allows Sato to more accurately consider his situation, and, as much as he doubts Misaki's intentions, he signs her contract. He is willing to accept the chance because in these moments following the meeting with Hitomi, he has no real issue with the status of shut-in, since Hitomi had no issue with it, and keeping up the facade of being productive is more difficult, more labour-intensive even, than simply accepting the perceived lower social status. At the park, Sato admits to Misaki that he has stopped making a game, and Misaki confirms that Sato has never made a game in the past either. She then asks what a gal game is, and in a moment of return to form, Sato tries to make up some long-winded excuse about Luigi Galvani to avoid the perception of pervert, but as soon as he is given pushback, abandons the attempt and admits that too was a lie. She asks him if he is a NEET, and he admits such before handing over the contract. This is the most definitive moment where the beginning ends and we get into the meat of the show. The stage has been set, the characters introduced, and the counselling has begun. With Sato back at home, we overhear a screaming call between Yamazaki and his parents, but we find out that they have little sway over him as he pays for his own expenses. This allows us some contrast to Sato in the moment, and is of later importance, foreshadowing the later struggle between Yamazaki and his family. Jumping to the first counselling session, Misaki asks some questions before Sato asks about her book, to which she tells him that the book contains her secret notes. This notebook actually contains her plan for the counselling sessions and how they will attain her the outcome she wants. She tells Sato that he needs to find a way to relate to society, and her first suggestion is God, saying that belief in God gives meaning to many followers, and gets caught on some kanji saying that Japan has 8 million gods, to which Sato corrects her that it is likely the kanji for myriad instead. This moment shows us that Sato is an intelligent individual behind the conspiratorial derangement. He has the potential to be capable, but does not want to. He has evolved from his phase of mostly delusion into his phase of pure avoidance, which characterizes a lot of Sato's actions going forward. Misaki moves on to Freud, and again, being no neuron slouch, Sato, when prompted, presents a Freudian model altogether too racy. Misaki checks his answer, generally showing that Sato is more familiar with the material than Misaki is, and is embarrassed, moving swiftly on to Jung. Sato pushes back, realizing that he has done something amusingly goading. This causes Misaki to awkwardly leave for the night, resulting in regret for Sato as he is once again alone in his room. Internally, he thanks Misaki for giving him a reason to continue, and considers that as long as he is heading towards a goal, he is not a hikikomori. In a modern Chinese sense, he is not partaking in let it rot, meaning that he is not resigned to oncoming failure entirely. Sato goes to Yamazaki and tells him that instead of quitting making the game, he actually wants to make something good, as finishing the project may be a substantive step between his current state as failure towards something better. And in a united moment, Sato steps on one of Yamazaki's figurines, crushing it. Tragic. It would seem that the impetus given by simply recognizing reality through the moving force of Mizaki and the realignment Hitomi offers has finally given Sato the ability to try something, even if that is just writing the plot for an H game. Sato tries and fails to write lazily enough to create an H game script. We get some potential backstory at the avoidant perfectionism involved in Rebuild, wherein Hitomi apologizes for thoroughly deconstructing the first novel Sato had written that he had shown her, and she regrets dissuading him from writing further via the club. At the next counseling session, Mizaki tells Sato that to speak to other people, he needs to overcome paranoia and the feeling that others are looking down at him. She suggests that one can get around this by simply looking down on the other person, and in this we get a hint at her true motive. In her words, quote, "If you don't have a sense of self-confidence, just pretend like whoever you are talking to is an even worse person than you are, and if you find it too difficult to elevate yourself, you just have to put everyone else below you. That way, even if they do think you're stupid, at least you're even. It's quite calming. There, you see? With this method I'm able to talk to you with confidence, or at the very least a sense of superiority." Unquote. This quote not only gives away her entire motivation for the show, but further gives us a mild insight into how she truly sees herself. Sato, rather than considering this however, is irritated that she is looking down on him, self-absorbed as ever, and wants to rediscuss Freud. Mizaki sighs, accusing Sato of being a virgin, and Sato is offended. He denies it, of course, because we are aware that Sato has previously lost his virginity to Hitomi in the literature club. Mizaki does not believe him, and reveals that even Yamazaki had managed to get a girlfriend, to which Sato expresses his own disbelief. Sato, told to check for himself, has anxiety about asking on the way home. He considers that finding it to be true, false, or otherwise would be equally unpreferable. Sato follows Yamazaki the next day to his university. Getting lost, he runs into a teacher and is invited to a game design class, which he is too awkward to turn down. He reminisces about his old perception of university and his early dropping out. The game he designs is effectively just a relaxing VN wherein no hardship is present. The professor, around the class, looks over his shoulder and laughs. He expresses that he wasn't directly laughing at him, but Sato does not believe him. He accuses the teacher of looking down on him, but the teacher rebuts and says that Sato, not willing to hear from anyone above his skill level, is the one truly looking down on others. This triggers Sato's conspiratorial thinking. He believes that everyone in the class is looking down on him, and runs away, saying that the NHK had set him up. He hides in a quiet place until he overhears Yamazaki talking to a woman. In this, Sato considers that Yamazaki has set him up in a conspiratorial manner, getting him to focus on 2D girls so that he can hoard the 3D girls. The girls' friends arrive and they depart, and as they do, Sato overhears Nanako, the girl, say that Yamazaki is not her boyfriend, and only a friend, as they talk down Yamazaki within earshot of the man himself. Sato, taking pity on him, decides not to tell him what he overheard, and instead act like he had simply seen Yamazaki talking to a woman successfully. Yamazaki tells him that they have been dating for 2 weeks, and that 3D is greater than 2D. With the knowledge that Sato has, he contemplates, sadly. The cycle of finding a love interest and being hurt, followed by being angry at all potential love interests, is, for Yamazaki, continuing. At that night's counseling session, however, Mizaki cares little about Yamazaki's situation, and instead simply congratulates Sato on going outside alone. Sato awakes, his room filled with trash, and feigns a cold so that Yamazaki will deliver him groceries to avoid having to go outside. Going to the school is more taxing than expected, and Sato has delved even deeper into seclusion. He no longer answers his phone. He doesn't want to live. He doesn't want to die. He would simply rather cease to be. He argues with his furniture before getting a call falling to voicemail. It turns out to be his mother. She will visit him and wants to have lunch with him about his future. This is catastrophic for Sato, as she may bring him home if she finds out how little he has done. When the phone rings again, he picks it up. His mother tells him he has 2 days before she visits, and further, that he can't stay there doing nothing, and that he will have to come home and find a job if he is not in education. He lies, telling her that he writes software and has a girlfriend that he may marry. His mother wants to meet this person. Sato is disheartened and surprised that she believed his lie, further saddened by the fact that he has just lied to his mother. He reflects on how much his mother trusts his word as the phone rings. He picks up in a panic, only to find out that it is Mizaki. She tells him that he'll have to pay the 1,000,000 yen fine for failure to appear, but Sato says that he has an excuse. He tells her, at the park, that his mother is visiting, and he has told her that he is employed and has a girlfriend. Misaki chastises him, but tries to offer to pretend to be his girlfriend as he runs off to Yamazaki. He convinces Yamazaki to make a company on the spot. This does not entail that much, as they only need to make it look like a real company. When he has to consider the girlfriend aspect again, he rushes off to ask Hitomi, and when that falls through, he considers Yamazaki dressing up as a woman, before Misaki interrupts and offers more directly. He reluctantly accepts. Misaki demands a practice date, because Sato is a bad liar. He is concerned that he will have a social episode, but Misaki comforts him. She says that as long as she is with him, he'll be fine. This fully saturates Misaki's goal of being needed, and thusly is a total success for her in this moment, so in retrospect, it makes sense as to why she was so insistent. She, throughout the day, stops him from smoking and forces him to engage in normal behaviours as they traverse the same city he visited earlier with Yamazaki. This is a great moment of contrast, as she offers a city visit based in normalcy, whereas Yamazaki's visit really only offered corporate perverted consumerism. As ever though, Sato is consumed by his prior failings. His past haunts his present, and he thinks of Hitomi. The fact that he failed in the past limits his ability to act in the present. Misaki asks him to walk arm in arm, and his elbow touches her breast, abjectly distracting him, and he walks into a pole. A lesson in awareness, one would hope. Back at the park, Sato says that all he knows about Misaki is her name, and Misaki reveals she knows much more about Sato than that and starts listing things off. When asked, she tells him that these are things that he has told her. However, he had never told her his phone number, which she had earlier called him using. He asks about her, but she begins talking of family lineage as opposed to anything of actual note about her, and thusly Sato fails to really pay attention, so is given memorizing her family tree as homework. Misaki revels in the situation, dressing up for the event. When she gets to Sato's apartment, however, he had been cleaning for hours, and, paranoid about footsteps in the distance, pulls Misaki inside his room out of panic. Being grasped so suddenly, Misaki does not resist at all, simply staring like a deer in headlights. Misaki comments on the mess and, happy to clean, begins helping. As usual, this is a moment of feeling needed, so is ultimately fulfilling for her. They end up having to throw trash into the loft, which causes a cascade of trash to come down onto them when Misaki pulls the fax from his mother from the edge of the loft. One may note again, Sato trying to cut corners and find an easy, lower effort way of doing things had failed. Sato's mother arrives after a short while of cleaning, and Sato slinks away to inform Misaki, wherein she asks him if she can throw away the anime figurine he bought with Yamazaki in episode 4. Of all the obvious trash around her, she is fixated on the figure, likely because it, for a while, supplanted Sato's dependency on her with a fixation on odd lewd paraphernalia and media. It turns out that Sato's mother doesn't even want to see the apartment, but instead just wants to go to lunch with the couple. Misaki emerges from the dingy room and we see that she is awkward. It's interesting to note that it seems Misaki has an equally difficult time engaging with strangers. Sato's mother, however, finds it cute and takes a liking to her. At dinner, Misaki plays along with the marriage ploy, but then Sato's mother asks what Misaki likes about Sato, and therein the ploy falls apart. Misaki says that he is handsome and cool and knows a lot about computers before running out of ideas. Sato gets up to use the bathroom, and Sato's mother has figured out the scheme. Misaki, when pressed, tries to hold up the ruse but eventually crumbles. Sato's mother is not angry, and Misaki confides that she is jealous that Sato has such a good mother. Sato tries to, when leaving the restaurant, admit the truth after contemplating a time in his childhood wherein he promised to never lie to his mother. But when he goes to do so, his mother tells Misaki to take care of him, and to have a little date. Sato's mother likes Misaki, and further likes that it means that he has some prospects. After a moment of wait, Misaki wants to continue the date, but Sato goes to leave and is stopped by Misaki, who tells him that they should take his mother's advice. The walk goes quite well, and they find themselves at a couple's spot. She tells him, playing on his need for perception undoubtedly, that they will look out of place if they don't lock arms. Further on the walk, couples are kissing around a wooded area, and she attempts to push this issue too. Sato is, when offered a kiss, distracted by her lipstick and hesitates, considering his situation. When he finally, after pausing, goes in for a kiss, he is interrupted by a phone call from Yamazaki, who has been waiting for a call from Sato's mother all day. If he had not hesitated, it's quite likely that he would have gotten his kiss. Tragic. Another opportunity evaporates because of Sato's avoidance of making a definitive choice on action. Now a third through the show, we find that Yamazaki has been rejected by Nanako for the fireworks festival. He masks his upset as she pretends to be disappointed before, still within earshot, dropping the act with her friends and quickly forgetting about him. Sato and Misaki have a somewhat distracted counselling session, and Sato, back at home, considers that she could just be part of the conspiracy as an agent. His considering is interrupted by drunk Yamazaki, who tells Sato that they have to go to Comic Market with a magazine dated 2006, containing the booth his classmates are attending. Yamazaki wants a booth because he had talked up his game to his classmates drunkenly and overstated Sato's competence. As far as the story for the game goes so far, he has modelled, as far as we can see, the character on a more action-capable version of himself in Literature Club as an idealised version of events that he would rather have happened. Every time he's writing, though, he cannot help but think of Mizaki. Yamazaki accuses Sato of being in love with Mizaki, saying that romantic love is a concept from overseas, which is ironic considering that Yamazaki eventually has what amounts to an arranged marriage after currently chasing Nanako, striving for that exact romantic love. Sato parries, pointing out that Yamazaki has modelled the visual of the love interest after Nanako. Yamazaki seethes and gets himself an alcoholic beverage. A rebuke so cutting leaves him with no response. After a drink, Yamazaki admits that this is true and berates himself for falling for women again. And then we are treated to a backstory where a tomboy saves Yamazaki from bullying in a way very similar to how Sato did later, and thusly, Yamazaki falls for her, eventually asking her to the fireworks. He gets an excuse that she has to spend the day with her ill grandparent, only to find out, eventually, that she went to the fireworks with someone else. This early experience with deceit marred Yamazaki's feelings going forward, but ultimately, we may see that Yamazaki may have harboured the resentment for this one a bit too closely. Springboarding from this, Yamazaki says that Mizaki is probably laughing at Sato right now for being a shut-in, trying to share his coping method with Sato. He has him hold up a cut-out magazine for a mask and shout, "Begone, dirty whores," which Sato is apprehensive of at first, but quickly becomes quite enthusiastic in loudly exclaiming. Yamazaki gets a call from Nanako and is invited to the fireworks by her, and immediately, his prior position dissolves. He spent this whole span of time breaking down Sato's perception just to renege at the first possibility of romance, showing the fickle nature of Yamazaki's cope. Abandoned by Yamazaki, Sato lies in his bed in a depressed stupor until Mizaki throws rocks at his window, cancelling the night's counselling to invite him to the fireworks. Sato accepts, they go together, but Sato, even while having a good time, considers the possibility of the situation being a trap. Upon holding Mizaki's hand after a bump, though, he accepts, in one of the most courageous moments we see from Sato in the entire show, that even if it is a trap, it is a risk he is willing to take. This is an odd moment from Sato, as much of the story revolves around his total lack of willingness to make a choice which involves any level of personal risk or required effort. It is notable that this almost feels as if it were the last episode of the show. If this was the last episode of the show, it would be a hopeful tale of overcoming regret and being willing to offer oneself to new opportunities when they rear their heads. Of course, this would make the show less of an agonizingly poignant depiction of the continual failure people suffer at the hands of the regret they travel with. In the next episode, Yamazaki has swapped his position on women entirely after one positive experience. Sato, in typical Sato fashion, has regrets. This time, it is about not doing more for Mizaki while on their date at the fireworks. It is interestingly Kierkegaardian that even his positive experiences are dripping in regret. As the quote goes, "Do or do not, you will regret both." Sato has, in his script writing, absent-mindedly written Mizaki's name in place of the female lead. He experiences embarrassment and tries to destroy the laptop, whereas Yamazaki says to just swap the names. This is a good microcosm of the two's issues respectively. Yamazaki's anger and resentment is conditional and can flip based on events. But Sato's problem is a state of being. His regret and sorrow is constant and only builds, ebbing and flowing in how aware of it he is, but never decreasing. Yamazaki then goes to meet Nanako, and Sato, therefore, does nothing the entire day, sitting alone in the dark, waiting to meet Mizaki again. He recognizes this in some small way and goes to the park early, finding Mizaki feeding a stray cat, symbolic and also in character. They discuss the virtue of feeding strays. Sato says that their adoration is fleeting, and that they will move on when not fed, but Mizaki counters. She says that such is fine because, as long as she continues feeding it, she will get what she wants out of that relationship. It's interesting just how often Mizaki outright states her intentions throughout the show. During counselling, their message is positive. They have a nice enough time, and Sato considers smoking a cigarette but decides not to after looking at Mizaki. In this moment, we see a Sato who is genuinely considering another person and making a somewhat difficult decision in order to better that other person's life as opposed to his own. In another show, this would be epilogue. In Welcome to the NHK, this is simply tragic. At home, he considers marriage with Mizaki but further ponders why he still knows so little about her. At this point in the show, Sato would probably be able to create a real and enjoyable relationship virtually identical to the one they have at the end of the show with less intense terms and less trauma, if it wasn't for Sato's worst enabler banging on his door, abjectly drunk. Yamazaki's date went badly, and he tells Sato, who is already trying to ponder why Mizaki wants to help him so much, that women will lie to you without a thought. An ambulance siren goes off in the background, almost to warn the viewer that this is an outright disaster. Nanako was apparently talking to someone else while they prepared for their date, and Yamazaki tells Sato to never put his guard down around women, because they're always plotting something, and this, when Sato is back in his room, sullies his perception of Masaki's actions. He now views Masaki's counselling as less benevolent, but conspiratorial and predatory viewed via Yamazaki's lens. She is then, in a hallucination, rolled into his NHK conspiracy, leaving him even more lonely and depressed. He feels his isolation internally, with only the slightest ignition given by Yamazaki. Sato takes Yamazaki on a scouting mission, and they discover that Masaki lives in the house on the hill, which has a perfect view down on Mita House and into their windows. Sato's furniture, at home, berate him into submission. They tell him to stop seeing her so that he doesn't fall in love and get hurt, mirroring Yamazaki's messaging, and thusly, his paranoia has led him into the avoidance of possibility once again. He goes to the park, only to tell her that he does not want to see her ever again, and in his avoidance and regret sprints away before a response. As this occurs, a stray cat goes to Misaki, almost mocking their earlier conversation. In this episode, he actively chose to live as a shut-in as opposed to suffering the possibility of being hurt, diametrically opposed to the last episode, because of the influence of Yamazaki and Yamazaki's own need to share his misery. Thusly, episode 11 has placed us thoroughly in the trenches. We've rolled back the clock, and Sato and Yamazaki are lonely and depressed. We then get a view into Hitomi's life with her boyfriend, and, I would argue, the most detestable character in the entire show, Jokasaki. Hitomi feels not needed and unimportant. She feels that her fiancé's consuming business is a sign of her insignificance. She takes pills in the shower and scrolls a suicide forum, telling them about her day. She makes up a fictional story to sound significant about how her boyfriend, who she imagines as Sato, got angry over the idea of her taking more hours at work and therefore getting to see her less. This, of course, is the exact inverse of her situation. She notes that whenever she thinks of someone with problems, she thinks of Sato. At work, further, she is not taken seriously. Her ideas, again, are not treated as important or needed. Her boyfriend further tells her that he'll be at work for even longer, and tells her to go on a vacation they had planned, alone. She tells him, however, that she will cancel the hotel and reservation. She, ending the call, stares into the dark hallway, breathes, and opens a full pill case. She takes another pill, warping her perception as she begins to hear some of those hallucinations we see Sato having. She, however, is less horrified and more amused to see the little NHK tiny figure guys, laughing. She expects it. Sato, at the same time, thinks about Hitomi congratulating him on no longer being a shut-in, and telling him to not let his guard down since the conspiracy is still ever present. His phone rings, and he is worried that it may be Misaki, but is hopeful when he finds it to be Hitomi. He stares, taking no action other than appreciation, for too long as ever, and the call drops. In this moment, Sato's inaction may have cost him an opportunity once again, if Hitomi did not call him again. It is notable that Hitomi, despite constantly wanting Sato to finally take some action, had to be the one to take action twice in a row before Sato would actually acknowledge her. She is quite intoxicated, drives like a madman, and arrives at Mita House shortly after calling him. She seems, to the viewer, vastly too happy for the situation we had prior seen her in. But considering that the Hitomi we see is either going to come out of this having claimed Sato or committed suicide, it is understandable why in this moment she acts recklessly. She comments, inside, that it feels like they are in high school again, and one may note that the last time she talked about high school, her comment was that they should have dated. And then she tries to hand him a deck of cards. She tries to replicate the old days, to go back to that older time, and Sato stares. While he may not be actively engaging when playing cards, this is specifically tragic, as it shows the regression of his willingness to engage entirely. She shrugs it off and continues to drink. Sato is consumed by thought, remembering a time where Hitomi was this happy. Back at the high school culture festival night, Hitomi breaks up with her boyfriend and comes to Sato, smiling and excited, and hands him a drink. She tells him of the breakup and, prompting him, asks if he is happy, to which she only gets the tepid, crushing answer of, "If you are." She wanted him to finally give a definitive answer as to whether he wants to date her, and he failed to do so even when given a truly golden opportunity. She is acting within the social expectations of her as the functional and normal person she perceives herself to be and works to be perceived as forwardly as possible to get Sato's attention. Notably, this relates to the current as pointed out by Sato. The framing indicates that she is willing to, once again, break up with someone for Sato, but Sato did nothing at the time and does nothing now. He recognizes in this moment that, at the time, if he had done anything, he had a chance to be together with Hitomi and have a different, better life, but it was the inaction that caused him to fail at opportunity. He thinks that this is his chance to get a redo, but ultimately he has once again spent too much time thinking about it and she's passed out by the time he's willing to say anything. We get another flashback where she came to say goodbye in high school and shows him a paper from Off, the suicide site, and then too it seems that Sato did very little. Sato bails on Comic Market to go on vacation with Hitomi and is ready when she wakes. He leaves a note explaining the situation to Yamazaki that ultimately reads like a suicide note. Sato then experiences some very poorly worded statements. He asks to come with her to paradise or the far reaches of hell. She looks at the note from off in her bag and assumes, because of this wording, that he had read the note and also wishes to go. After some convincing, she agrees, shedding a tear. Mizaki, in her room, sees Sato get in the car with Hitomi and rushes down the hill worried. She trips as she runs and can only cry out. Not like she'd catch the car anywhere, but the trip is insult to injury. Sato thinks that he is starting a new life, whereas Hitomi thinks that he is aware that the intention of the trip is the end of life, and thusly asks, "You won't have any regrets, will you, Sato?" The problem with this statement is that at this point in the show, we should recognize that virtually everything Sato does leaves him racked with regret, and Hitomi, being probably the best Sato whisperer in the show, likely also realizes this. Sato is filled with optimism. He has the active thought that he has to do whatever he can to try to make Hitomi happy, but this is solely from his own lens. He does not consider what Hitomi wanted from any of the prior flashbacks that he's already had, and instead tries to do basic niceties throughout the day that are entirely general as opposed to the extremely specific desires that Hitomi quite openly has. The two meet with a group of dreary-looking individuals, and Sato is confused that there are multiple gloomy people coming along to the vacation. They ask Hitomi if this is the guy she talked about on the forum, meaning the abusive boyfriend, and she reluctantly confirms. They look with scorn for a moment before giving in to the futility of the situation. The group try to weakly convince themselves not to go to the suicide island, but Sato, still thinking it's a vacation, works as hard as possible to convince them to keep going. Hitomi checks her phone gloomily throughout the day, still forgotten by Jogasaki. Eventually, on the boat to the island, she drops her phone into the ocean. She gives up on Jogasaki entirely as Jogasaki considers calling her, but is interrupted by work. He has finished his current task but goes to continue working anyway, at which point his team tells him to go home to his girlfriend. It seems like Hitomi may have been right about her lack of attention, as it seems that multiple people around Jogasaki have recognized it too. He gets home and is only really worried when he finds Hitomi's suicide diary. It is at this point he tries to call, but it is too late. And at this point he tries to find out where she has gone. His avoidance is via work. It is through the mode of something socially acceptable, and therefore his avoidance is more consuming. Realistically, Jogasaki is the alternate world Sato, and potentially even more avoidant, but further, totally unwilling to even grapple with the questions until they are forced upon him. Sato is amazed by the island and tries to have a happy, jovial time. Hitomi, at the same time, is weighed down by the setting. Sato is still confused as to why everyone else is gloomy and tries to socialize. The group shoot him down until he has an awkward, depressing conversation with the old man of the group, who owns the island. Mizaki goes to Yamazaki, who is freaking out about the missing comic market as she explains that Sato went out with Hitomi. Jogasaki appears at Mita House and asks for details. The rush is quite similar to Sato's rush at the end of the show, but, of course, is a more simple situation to resolve. Sato, through effort, convinces the group to make a bonfire on the beach. They come together and the old man thanks Sato, and tells him that he reminded him that the goal was to come here so that they could have a good time on the last day of their lives. It is this moment that Sato realizes that this is a suicide island. The extra fuel is taken from the boat to put on the fire, symbolically, as it is now too late to turn back. Sato, however, has the opportunity to stop this. Sato considers that this was meant to be an opportunity to restart life with Hitomi, and in this moment it is actually possible. If, in this moment, Sato told Hitomi that she was needed, that she is appreciated by him, and that he regrets the waste of time in their past, that is effectively all the words she wants to hear. The opportunity arises and, as he interjects to stop the fuel from being added to the bonfire, Hitomi calls to him. Of course, given the opportunity to say something in front of Hitomi, Sato turns it down. He decides to instead simply go along with the crowd and throw the fuel on the fire himself. Yamazaki, in the car with Jogasaki and Mizaki, berates Mizaki for supposedly causing Sato's will to suicide, ignoring his own huge contribution to Sato's deterioration. Mizaki looks at her hand, thinking about the fireworks festival hand-holding. She considers that it was not enough of a reason for Sato to keep living. Back on the island, Hitomi brings up the culture festival and the similarities. In this, Hitomi gives Sato a verbal chance to say anything, considering the mistake he made was never comforting her in that moment and further not admitting his real feelings, hiding them for the sake of avoiding the possibility of a negative outcome. It is possible to conclude that in this moment that they are about to kill themselves, she may think that the negative outcome happening anyway may motivate him into action, but that would be to underestimate Sato's lack of will to act in any way to better his life if there is the slightest possibility of pushback, and Sato simply timidly agrees with her. Mizaki and Yamazaki board a rental boat in pursuit of Sato, and Yamazaki continues to blame the situation in its entirety on Mizaki playing with Sato. However, Mizaki argues that she needs Sato and has been searching for someone like him. Internally, she tells herself that someone like Sato means too much to her for her to lose him now. The fire burns out on the beach and the group begins to move to the suicide point. Sato is hesitant and Hitomi stops following the group for a moment to look at him. Another chance to say anything is given, but after a moment, Sato gets up and goes along with the group. In this moment, he has become a passenger in his own life. He cannot escape his state of passivity and is, thusly, his own worst enemy in every aspect. The old man, at the suicide point, thanks Sato for convincing him to kill himself without regrets. Hitomi has a moment alone with Sato, and she embraces him. She says that she knew things would end up this way and that he would, ultimately, be with her in the end. She tells him that if they meet again in another life, they have to play cards again. The tragedy of this moment is heartbreaking. She has moved from wanting something more than cards, to accepting the cards, to yearning to just have the cards back. He hugs her back, accepting, and says that next time he will never let her go, to which she thanks him. The recognition has been undergone, their regrets laid bare, and both wish that Sato had done something at the time. The fact that Sato, in this moment, with Hitomi begging him to pay attention to her and be with her in the next life, cannot simply ask if she will go with him right now to attain instantly the thing that he came to the island with the intention of acquiring, is another tragic failing. If Sato said anything of his feelings in this moment to the woman who has already admitted that she loved him and the woman who is asking him to in a potential future be with her, he would more than likely get the girl, but he cannot do it. He simply puts it off to the next life to avoid having to take action right now, even if that action is served to him on a plate and all he has to do is say yes. Avoidance, as is a trend, strikes down Sato's chances at success. The two end their embrace and head towards the edge of the cliff. Hitomi lets a tear go for her boyfriend but continues onwards anyway. A second regret has bubbled up for Hitomi but lasted notably shorter, barely even slowing her travel towards the edge. In this moment, the medical student wavers. He can't go on because he cannot put others through the mourning his suicide would result in. The medical student tells him that they all have someone that would miss them. Hitomi thinks about this, but looks unfazed. The old man tells the medical student that since his company went under, his wife and child left, but the medical student rebukes him. He tells him that only if he is alive he can begin the process of rebuilding. The teen with them, we discover, was threatened by punks and had to steal a large amount of money from his parents, but the old man offers to connect him with an old lawyer friend who can help. Sato considers that they may survive this moment before Hitomi pulls him closer to the edge, resolute. The regret of not being with Sato, and the current pain of not being needed or wanted, cannot be overcome as easily as the other three's issues, as it is something concrete. The past is not changeable, and the state of being unwanted is, at that moment, quite evident from the situation. She wanted anyone on the path here to treat her as if she matters, to tell her that she is wanted. She asks Sato to go with her to a new world and he, without thinking, accepts. Sato regrets this unthinking acceptance as they travel towards the edge, but he puts up little resistance, whereas Hitomi charges ahead. She wants to restart. As they hit the edge, Jogasaki, Yamazaki, and Mizaki arrive on their old boat. In this moment, Jogasaki declares that she is important and asks her to get married. Hitomi, finally feeling needed, ceases her will to die. She is finally, in this moment, hearing the words she wanted to hear the whole time. She has been told that she matters. This, however, convinces Sato to jump. He has watched his opportunity slide into nothingness and someone else has, at the last moment, as he was about to squander that opportunity, took it for themselves as it was so very easy to accomplish. His regret has culminated in this moment and he goes to jump. The people around him complain, but Sato tells them to just look away, and then Mizaki tries to talk him down. She tells him that he is a human, a failure of a human, who is special. He is more useless than she is, lower than her, and lower than a stray dog. She needs him because she needs someone to feel better than, and she needs someone so pathetic that they need her. This does not convince him, as he stares in disbelief. The group try to hold him back as he goes to jump, and Yamazaki then takes the microphone and cuts to the heart of the matter. He tells Sato that people like them do not deserve a dramatic death, and instead deserve a bland, boring death that nobody will care about. Accepting, dejected, he is told by Hitomi that they should go home, and he agrees, defeated. He steps away from the cliff edge, but as he does so, it crumbles, and he plunges. He holds onto the edge and is pulled up by the suicide group. Moments earlier, he was going to jump, but in this moment he chooses not to, simply because he's been told that he does not deserve the fanfare. We then get one of the most harrowing, pained screams in anime or fictional media at large as he lies on his back on solid ground, and the regret hits him. In another moment of Kierkegaardian irony, do or do not, he regrets both. He doesn't want to jump, he doesn't want to live. He more basically doesn't want to do anything. Misaki silently cries aboard the boat. Sato, throughout much of the show, refuses to act at all, and this episode, and the last, are the purest examples of this. Sato has had so many chances to try and stop Hitomi, and I would wager that any of these would have netted him a relationship with the object of his desire, to whom Sato is also an object of desire. If he had done this, he could have begun to undo his regret. With only a couple of words, even likely on the cliff, he could have said, not in the next life, but in this life. As we see from the offer of an affair later, he could have had this relationship. But in all of these moments, he simply lets them pass. With all of these failings compounding into a concrete marriage proposal onto the woman that he had loved, he is forced to simply lay there, screaming in anguish over his situation. Episode 14 changes the intro. We cut out the brass and instead have a whirring, droning keyboard and some choice piano adding a haunting tone in the hot mix. We see Misaki behind Sato, trying to think of what to say, eventually fumbling her wording and saying, "So good thing you didn't die." Huh? Which is quite obviously not what Sato, in this moment, wants to hear. Considering what we've seen, this is likely not something Sato agrees with. He turns, ready to throw a punch at Misaki, enraged by the poorly thought out question. It is interesting to note that this is one of the few times Sato chooses to do something concrete, even if he backs out of it. At the sight of this, Misaki crumbles and covers her head, frozen by fear. Sato stops, pauses, and still angry, raises his fist again. Ultimately though, Sato cannot bring himself to act and just holds his fist in the air and shouts at her until she finally tells him to stop and, importantly, to go away. Sato says that he was a lot more scared than she was. The irony of this, considering we later find out that Misaki has PTSD from being violently beaten and hated as a child, is agonizing. Aboard the ship, Sato wishes to simply stop being, and a still dejected Hitomi rests her hand on Jogasaki's. She was stopped and found joy in that moment, but now she doesn't look much better off than prior. Back on the mainland, the group go to a hot spring and express regret for going to the suicide island, other than a largely silent Sato. Eventually, the parents of the teen and medical student come to confront them about their attempt, and their situations resolve in bittersweet conclusions, but ultimately, their situations do resolve. Yamazaki has had to leave to man the comic market booth alone, and as they go to leave, Hitomi tries to apologize to Sato, saying that it was selfish to get him wrapped up in the situation. Sato says that it's fine, and tells it to try to be happy. This, once again, is typical Sato avoidant behavior. Of all the genuine feelings Sato could express, he chooses to take a noble position of self-denial. This is, more accurately, pure avoidance hiding under the facade of stoicism for Hitomi's benefit, whereas, in reality, if Sato was honest with Hitomi, she would have a better life. She is aware of this and sadly gazes at him through the window as she gets in the car with Jogasaki and drives away. Hitori Bochi by Pearl Kyodai pulls together the empty feeling of the scene as we're left with the old man and Sato, both people who have made a mess of their personal relationships. The old man is going to drive Sato to the train station until the man's child comes to him and tells him that his wife would like to give him another chance, and like that, Sato is the only person of the offline meeting to not have any resolution. Sato, as well as arguably Hitomi, was the only person to go to the island with something to gain, and thusly, Sato, as well as, again, arguably Hitomi, is the only person who leaves with no answers. He leaves vastly worse off than when he went. We cut to Sato on the train, blank, and back in Tokyo he glances upon the house on the hill. There's a letter waiting for him, in his home, from Misaki, telling him that she'll be waiting in the usual place. Sato lays down in the dark, staring at the ceiling. He considers Misaki's words when he was on the cliff. His earlier desire for a positive perception has been thoroughly beaten out of him. Yamazaki interrupts Sato's contemplation once again, and blames Sato for the poor sales at Comic Market. Now is a good time to point out that Hitomi, as a character, attracts a certain level of vitriol that Yamazaki does not, and it's interesting that Yamazaki gets a level of charity that is sparsely extended to Hitomi. There is a set of people who accuse Hitomi of being a selfish user, while Yamazaki does such openly and nobody bats an eye. In another gut-wrenching line this show hits the viewer with, Yamazaki tells Sato that he should have put off killing himself until Comic Market was over. At the park, Misaki presents a copy of the contract, holding it in front of her face so that she can hide behind it. She says that because he missed counseling for a few days, he'll be fined 1 million yen, but since she withheld secrets from Sato, she will dispense with the fine this time, but the contract will go on. At this, Sato has a moment of anger, grabs the contract and pulls it away from her, causing Misaki to cower again. Once more, Sato stills in shock as she cries. Surprisingly, she thanks him for coming back anyway, and, after a moment of contemplation, Sato says that he's glad to be back. The anger we see from Sato has subsided. Whether this is because he's actually less angry, or just because he's following the path of least resistance, is unknown. It is somewhat sad to consider that she is so dependent on Sato to feel needed that despite the fact that she was afraid of him attacking her on the island, she is still happy to continue counselling. We end episode 14 finding out that Sato's father has fallen ill, and most shockingly to Sato, his parents are going to cut his allowance in half. Sato goes to the store to find a job magazine and reads the listings, filled with despair. He does, however, remember a game trial code given to him by the teen after the suicide island, and being told about real money trading. Sato has now attained the average job prospects of a Venezuelan RuneScape flax farmer. Loading up the game, he is immediately approached and someone tries to sell him herbs. Even this interaction he runs away from. Yamazaki tells him he's meant to play with other people to be able to maximize grind ability, but also reminds him that they have to finish their game. Sato almost misses his counselling session. Today's is about people who let life pass them by, and the central message is that it is important to make improvements step by step. Sato, of course, takes this advice only in regards to his current objective of gold farming. He runs off without explaining that he's only thinking of gold farming, but thanks Misaki for explaining something important to him. She, however, believes that she might be getting through and is glad to be thanked. He misses the next session because he's farming, but Misaki forgives it because he could be doing something important. Sato, in-game, saves a cat girl named Mia, and again, Misaki is alone in the park. She wonders if Sato no longer needs counselling, whereas in reality, Sato is just suffering a genuine gaming addiction. There is an odd romantic moment with the cat girl, who Sato is taken by, and there's a foreboding scene where Misaki asks Yamazaki about Sato, wherein Yamazaki feigns ignorance, and when walking off, Yamazaki's character fades through into Mia, as Mia's coming online coincides with Yamazaki's return home. Sato is interrupted by Misaki at the door, and she is concerned for his safety when he doesn't answer. She enters, and we see what's become of Sato, ungroomed and in the dark amongst trash. The room had been relatively clean since the last time Misaki had cleaned for him, but now it was a total hole. Misaki tries to pull Sato from the computer, but Sato resists. Misaki decides that this is dangerous, and she believes that she will have to persuade Sato with, in her words, sex appeal, which turns out to just be cat ears and a tail. Why Misaki had these laying around, the world will never know. After some time, she returns and appears in Sato's doorway, meowing before telling Sato to get a hold of himself. She then offers to wear the costume to counselling if he returns. This offends Sato, who tells her to stop wearing it as he hurls objects at her. This leads to confusion, as Misaki had believed that Sato was into catgirls from Mia on screen. Misaki is not afraid, further, of the mockery of having to wear the costume as long as she is needed by Sato. Sato, enraged, yells at her to not make fun of his love for Mia, and, with plot foiled, Misaki runs off crying to do further research. Sato, in-game, marvels at the beauty of the world via the mode of the game, stuck entirely in his room, currently fully enraptured and unable to go outside. A party member mocks Sato's chances of being able to do RMT, and, from this, Kobayashi overhears her brother talking about Sato. This is the class committee head we often see trying to wrangle Sato's class in flashbacks, irate at his uninterested demeanour. Sato and Mia engage in more flirting, and eventually, Sato talks about how the world in-game is superior to the world outside, and asks Mia to party with Sato for the rest of his life, supporting her with supposed RMT profits. The one condition given is that Mia wants to see Sato in real life, and is already outside. The horror of his state and trash-filled room dawns on him, as well as the altogether terrifying situation of someone online being outside your door. The door slowly opens and we find that Mia has been Yamazaki all along, who had wanted to show Sato that it is possible to make up a character online and that people are not always who they say they are. Sato pretends that he knew that and lies, trying to protect his ever-declining perception again, by saying that he was playing for the RMT. This is obviously not true, and Yamazaki berates him for quite a time because Sato's approach to RMT, and RMT in general, is not practical for the average user. We get the somewhat horrifying visual situation posed to us by Yamazaki of a 50-year-old obese Sato living with his parents because his RMT never occurs despite playing the game for the next almost 30 years. Sato cries, coming back into alignment with reality. He says that at some point he was sucked in by the game and the romance therein, which was ultimately with Yamazaki. Sato paws at the screen and the figure of Mia, despite Yamazaki standing right behind him. Yamazaki plays his hand and tries to use this moment to convince Sato to continue work on the H game, and Sato explodes, rushing Yamazaki to attack him as Yamazaki retreats to his room and locks his door. Sato sits, pauses, and considers what to do next, and at this point, he gets a phone call from the committee head and Sato takes the bait to fall for an MLM. Misaki arrives at his apartment wearing a middle school uniform, a maid apron, and bearing freshly made food in an attempt to convince Sato once more, but Sato is not present. We find that he's met the committee head as an excuse to get out of the house. We get the information from Kobayashi that Sato, in high school, crafted a persona with a cold and condescending attitude, taking virtually nothing seriously. This personality existed to have an easier time coasting through high school, which he did not want to really engage with. Alternatively, Sato thought that Kobayashi cared too much about school and the things therein, telling her at the time that she cannot force how much she cares onto others. The change in Sato is large, but the base thread of non-engagement is still present. She finds out about his shut-in status and offers to introduce him to her mentor, whose details at this point are nebulous. On the way to meet this mentor, quite a long distance out, she asks him about online games and Sato tells her that he'll never play another game, and that those who do are dregs. Of course, this is upsetting for Kobayashi as she heard about Sato from her brother, who she is doing these scams to support, so that he can continue to play those games. She notices that since they are on a public train, his condition cannot be that crippling, but Sato disagrees, pointing out that only a few months ago he couldn't do more than go to the grocery store. She asks what improved his condition, and Sato ponders. He thinks over all the things that he has done with Misaki, but concludes that it is in fact a myriad of things and not Misaki's work, likely in an attempt to soothe his damaged ego. They eventually arrive at the mentor's location out in the Japanese boonies and meet a rotund man who guides them inside, who is of the same rank as Kobayashi. Inside, Sato recognizes it as an MLM, and we see that it likely has some sort of gang connection with large men intimidating the new recruits. It is further interesting that the other new recruits are caught up in the flow of events, but Sato, unwilling to engage with others usually, sees through the ploy quite easily. Sato plans to sneak away and is confronted by Kobayashi. He tells her that he is aware that it is a scam and jumps from a window to escape, only to be pursued. She admits that she was trying to screw him over and says that she too was dragged into it by an old friend. Sato tells her that that is her fault, and she agrees but doesn't care, not wanting to be the victim anymore. We hear that when Kobayashi came to Tokyo, she had to take sleazy jobs to get by, and that lack of stability pushed her to be vulnerable to the MLM. She further tells him that the world looks down on him for being a shut-in, and that society wants people like him to exist so that they have someone to look down on. This is what pierces Sato's armor, as this is the basis of Hitomi's conspiracy, and further the root of his meeting with Misaki. She tells him more that if you don't want to suffer, you have to make someone else suffer, and that if they work together, they can use Mouse Road to gain profits at the cost of others. Sato, his conspiracy satiated, agrees and returns to his room with huge amounts of poorly functioning detergent. Sato's delusions allowed him to be manipulated with a short monologue. Misaki has cleaned his room, and she and Yamazaki are waiting for him when he returns. He tells him that he has taken out a loan for the product, and Yamazaki immediately recognizes this as a pyramid scheme, and after some struggle, Sato realizes that he has been fooled by Kobayashi through playing on his conspiratorial thinking. Misaki runs off to research MLMs, and Sato finally gets to notice his apartment and the work Misaki has done cleaning and bringing him food. Yamazaki suggests returning the products, and Sato resists. On surface level, this may seem like pure avoidance, but as much as it is Sato, and yes, it is avoidance, it's also an action of self-sacrifice. He can justify his actions because to return the products would make Kobayashi's life worse. He is constantly striving for a noble death, and in this case, his failure could allow Kobayashi a chance. Of course, his friends do talk him out of this. This is something we have seen from Sato since telling Hitomi to not worry about him and just be happy. Misaki brings a book to his apartment about how to avoid MLMs, and the next morning, Sato calls Kobayashi to organize a meeting. On the train the next day, Sato believes that everyone is mocking him and looking down on him for falling for a pyramid scheme, struggling to breathe through the panic. Once again, Sato suffers from avoidance. He doesn't want to terminate his membership because of the awkwardness of the situation and his general lack of will to engage, but effectively, Yamazaki tells him that he has no choice. When the group confront Kobayashi about a cooling off period, however, she takes advantage of their general naivety to feign cooperation, saying that she'll bring the papers for cancellation soon, only to sell them more faulty products and memberships based on each of their own insecurities or desires, largely in the form of dietary supplements that are supposed to stave off shut-in disorders. Returning home with their products, Misaki drops her book and finds, after a short read, that it is common for MLMs to agree to a return of products, but then try, in that moment of goodwill, to sell you more product. After some light joking, they realize they have been duped. They realize they have to do cooling off again. This time, to get straight to those desired cancellation forms, they decide to go straight to Kobayashi's house, using the competition between herself and the other representative Sato had met at the initial mentor meeting to find out the location. They catch her outside her house and tell her that they have come to cool off. She tries to get them to go to a local restaurant to either upsell them or to keep them away from her brother, but the group does not trust her intentions and she ultimately gives in. The inside of Kobayashi's house is full of MLM products. She is in so much debt that she will lose her house and will not be able to pay for her brother, who pounds on the floor with his foot whenever he wants her to bring him food. The group sneak a look at what is pounding, and Sato finds it to be a player of the online game he and Yamazaki had played with, who has a true meltdown when he finally realizes that he is being observed by strangers, crying on the floor of his room in the dark. Hearing this, Kobayashi rushes to see the group and hurries them away, her brother screaming at her in anger over how she could bring people into the house. The group wait downstairs in silence, and give in the cancellation forms they have finally signed. Kobayashi says she is happy for Sato, but that her situation just got worse. She tells them that she joined the scheme partially because the supplements promised to cure her brother as well as the profit incentive, and then she simply got in too deep. When you are spending so much time trying to sell the product, she notes, you have precious little time to think about how you're going to get out of the MLM yourself. When their father died, she had to support herself and her brother and asks Sato, somewhat surreptitiously, if he is happy to see her like this. He responds by asking if she's going to continue like this, to which she responds that it's too late to go back. They go to leave before Kobayashi finds that her brother wishes to talk to Sato through the game and they fire up her old PC. It is tragic to see that even within the same house, Kobayashi's brother cannot have a face-to-face conversation that he wishes to have. He talks about the dreamlike potential of having a good future in RMT, and Sato counters, saying that the dream of RMT has crushed all of his sister's dreams. Yu's escapism comes at the cost of his sister's suffering. Yu responds that Sato is a hypocrite searching for that same escapism, and that he knows what he should do as he's read over 200 self-help books, but he will not act as he is afraid of change. He doesn't want to change into something else in a different setting. He wants to sustain the same setting, the same him, but with success spoon-fed to him by the hand of chance. Sato says that he knows how he feels, but is rebutted. Sato, the brother says, can still go back, and he tells Sato to not end up like him. Mizaki is quite torn up and goes to apologize to Yu, and as they leave, Mizaki comments that she feels sorry for Yu as we can hear his sobbing all the way outside. Mizaki, of course, recognizes that Yu Kobayashi is, effectively, an even more apt subject for her counseling, but that Sato is the person who was chosen. It must be difficult for Mizaki to look upon such an upsetting situation and know that she could have chosen instead to help this person if the situation was different, but the cards were simply dealt otherwise, and instead, Yu has to be helped by someone who is eaten alive by the requirement of supporting him, as opposed to herself, who relishes in the attention gained from helping Sato. Back at home, Mizaki has brought Sato tuna, to which he complains, but is reminded that now his allowance has been cut, she is the sole reason he can eat, and he, bested, thanks her. The news on the television, however, jump scares the crew with the news that the MLM had been raided and the leaders arrested. In a moment of shock, Mizaki knocks over a pot of tea onto Sato's crotch and rushes to dab him down with a tissue. Yamazaki comes over to celebrate and witnesses the two in what is mistakenly a compromising position. Thank you, Gonzo. We cut to Kobayashi's house post-arrest, and her brother is alone. He hasn't even noticed that she has been arrested, and he begins to starve. Kobayashi, after some time, returns and cannot find Yu. She calls Sato and, after calming, comes to terms with the futility of the situation. She comments that she looks terrible and weakly gets into the bath. Kobayashi's youth has been taken from her via stress and wasting time with Mouse Road to enable her brother's gaming. We cut, however, to her brother, who is now delivering food as a job. This happier Yu comes at the expense of the current state we see his sister in. The time spent has allowed him to get to this state, but now she is broken, bearing a criminal record, and racked with stress. She rests mournfully in the bath. The cruelty of the future coming at us all at full speed is displayed through her utter obliteration, with Kobayashi left to dwell in her regret and actions that she cannot undo. Skipping to the dead of winter, during game development, Yamazaki's mother calls him on the phone as his father is extremely ill and they want him to visit. Yamazaki must leave for the time, and leaves Sato with the direction of making the main character more shy. During a short montage, the soundtrack takes center stage over a quiet Sato who works in silence. A simple, melancholy score haunts the episode with the ghost of what was and now what is taken away. Mizaki visits him each day to bring him lunch and directs him to come to counseling each night. In the meantime, Sato remembers Hitomi during a night of stargazing at the club. Hitomi cares little for the process of astronomy and says that the light from the star will take so long to reach them that everything will be gone by the time it does, mulling over how short their time on Earth is. Sato waxes about the meaning of life, or the lack thereof, and then, at counselling, Mizaki does the same. It is notable that Mizaki's take on the transience of being is posed in more of a positive and accepting light, and the way Sato frames it as insurmountably defeating, and Hitomi views it as an example of futility. After some time, Yamazaki returns with souvenirs as his father has somewhat recovered, but not enough to continuously work the family business, meaning that Yamazaki will have to return or else the family will crumble. We find Yamazaki's reason for living in Tokyo. He found out that his entire life was planned out through an insurance draft by his aunt, given to his father. He didn't want to live a planned out life and wanted to make his own decisions, and this is what made his family angry, so he had to live at his own cost during education. He has a chance to make it big at Winter Comic Market, but if that fails, he will have to go and work the ranch. Working on said game, snow begins to fall and the two go to the park. It is cold, so Yamazaki begins burning his school textbooks as he will not need them anymore, and Sato watches, bemused, before taking a moment and accepting the situation. Yamazaki tells Sato that he's going to invite Nanako and show her his room, and Sato chuckles and claps, and comments on Yamazaki's lack of shyness, at which point Yamazaki says the script must have been fine all along. This serves a couple of functions. Firstly, the requirement for shyness is modelled after himself, and in giving up on that shyness, he's accepting the game as separate from his oncoming reality. And secondly, since the main female lead is modelled after Nanako, he has given up on that relationship in this moment and has decided to give that arc of his life a definitive ending. Nanako arrives, happy to be meeting with Yamazaki as Sato hides in the loft with a camera to capture her reaction. Somewhat dazed by the odd room, with tarps on the wall to hide the hentai and other paraphernalia, she is directed to take a seat before she asks about Yamazaki's father, which takes him aback. Nanako shows some genuine concern for Yamazaki, and he wavers for a moment before telling her that he's doing fine, and that they have more important things to discuss. He pulls down the tarps and reveals the game to her, telling her that the character is modelled after her. It is notable that Sato is watching his friend self-destruct and is simply amused by the sight. Nanako sighs. She says that she finds the age stuff gross, but the fact that he's so dedicated to things he likes is what she likes about him. Nanako displays genuine interest in a continuing relationship with Yamazaki, and it is at this point that Yamazaki plays his hand. He says that she is weird, and then suggests that she is also obsessed with H games and fantasizes about being assaulted by a tentacle monster. Yamazaki, understandably, gets punched, and told by Nanako that she wishes he was dead. Here we see something interesting. We see the loss as concrete, as Yamazaki intentionally ruined the moment so that when he leaves in the next month, there are no what-ifs that he could be held back by and try to flee back to. He must go to a faraway ranch, and that conflicts with Nanako's goal of being a big voice actor, ergo she cannot follow him. Nanako leaves, and our protagonists are left alone with their decision. We may note that Yamazaki has not applied his earlier standards to himself. He says that people like him and Sato do not deserve interesting deaths, and yet demands bombastic endings to the phases of his life, going as far as to require Sato to film events and work the set to be cinematographically interesting. It was quite obvious at the start that Nanako was not interested in Yamazaki, but his passion, perseverance, and tenacity won her over just for him to push her away to go back to how things were pre-planned all along for him. The game is complete. The main character is just a blend of the two, and the heroine is a one-dimensional, badly drawn PNG of someone they knew. They only sell 5 copies at Winter Comic Market, even with a reduced price. Sato considers that now the game is complete, it is as if the work had never been done at all. Yamazaki appears at his door, handing over his life-size Perurine figure and giving him his old laptop before we find the camera used in episode 3. We get to see the difference between Sato from episode 3 and now, and the moment is almost enheartening. He is now less of a shut-in, has a couple friends, and was doing things. This moment is one of Sato's healthiest, and it is also the time when the impetus for him to be somewhat productive is leaving. The two have a snowball fight in the cold, and Yamazaki tries to give himself an exciting TV-style dialogue as he throws snowballs. And of course, Sato decides to play along, and begins pelting Yamazaki with snowballs, vastly outclassing Yamazaki's snowball skills. Being defeated even in this moment, and in such an embarrassing way, causes Yamazaki some futile rage as he begins to pound Sato with snow on the ground. He is angry, more generally, at the situation he's been put in and the inability for him to make meaningful decisions or impact even in his own made-up snow fight situation. His dreams die around him. Sato makes another TV drama quip, but Yamazaki has been flattened. We are told that there are meaningful plots and resolutions in television, but their lives are nothing like that. Their lives are simply a collection of vague anxieties that are never really resolved. Yamazaki has been ground down by toiling over tedium with minuscule payoff at best. Yamazaki, leaving the next day, tells Mizaki that she has to take care of Sato. Yamazaki tells Sato, alternatively, to not let the world beat him down, and Sato complains. He tells Yamazaki that he's talking like it is the end for him, and Yamazaki simply smiles. It realistically is the end for Yamazaki. He has put an end to his own decision-making and handed it over to those who came before him. He will likely make similar decisions for his children, nephews, or nieces. The confines of his birth have made the decisions for him, and the failure of his one attempt to make his own way cemented that. Sato will, in the end, get to and have to make his own decisions. And what has he done with those? At this point in the show, they have accomplished the exact same amount. Sato is paralyzed with the inability to choose, whereas Yamazaki wants the ability and cannot have it. In this moment, Yamazaki is paradoxically resolute yet beaten down. He thinks of Nanako as he leaves. As much as he tried to make his ending definitive, as we see in much of the rest of the show, regret is ultimate and cruel. It comes for him no matter how hard he struggles. Kierkegaard at play once again. Sato reflects on the game. He says that he thought it would be good, but ultimately it was bad, and he feels bad for the people buying it. Sent into an episode, he, in pure corp, believes he is the world's creator and god, and tries to use his powers to summon Yamazaki back to Mita House. Without Yamazaki to distract his pondering, he can delve as far as he wants into his conspiracy. He asks if he even has any choice but to be a shut-in. Later, when Mizaki eats with him, he asks her if God really exists. Mizaki says she doesn't know, but thinks sometimes it'd be nice if he did. She comes to realize the difficulty of supporting Sato alone, as now it is only her. But this, luckily for Sato, is also the feeling which feeds her. She gives him, at counselling, the test of a New Year's shrine visit. New Year's Eve comes around and he goes to meet Mizaki, ready to go to the shrine. He follows and engages in a little small talk, and ultimately panics in a large crowd. He masks this for Mizaki's sake, but is lost in thought about how he survived at the crowd in Comic Market. He considers that it was almost like he was no longer a hikikomori then, and this reminds him that he is, in fact, a hikikomori. The panic has caused him to lose Mizaki in the crowd. Panic eats him, and he hides away in an alley. Hitomi runs into him, noticing him in the alley as she walked around aimlessly on the street on a dense international holiday. Jogasaki is not with her. He has had, after the proposal, no change in attentiveness. She did not get what she wanted from the arrangement, but instead only got a fleeting moment of being acknowledged. Regret will always rear its head, but at this time it has offered Sato one final chance with his oldest and most prominent regret. Sato has two options and, up to this point, he has failed to choose either. He has Mizaki, who loves him, and Hitomi, who, still most notably, loved and likely still loves Sato. Suicide Island, and now, the notable loner and cold surface statuette Hitomi, would not be likely to chase after someone she barely feels for. Mizaki runs around the streets trying to find him, as we see Sato imagine renting a love hotel with Hitomi. We get the fade out, the little guys in the memory, and a warp back to the same moment. In this mental machination though, Hitomi admits all her feelings to Sato directly and takes all the actions onto a passive Sato. This is much the problem. Sato requires being approached by a woman, in this case, who has shown that she is eminently and, importantly, only willing to go with him if he is the one who asks. The two talk, in the real world again, about Sato's shut-in status, and Sato says that a lot has happened. Hitomi mirrors this statement more negatively. Sato notices the ring on her finger as she asks him if he is alone. They go to a restaurant and talk about the evening. Sato asks if she lost her fiancé in the crowd, and Hitomi shoots down this idea. Sato asks if it was a fight, and Hitomi says, not really. Apparently he got an important call from a client on New Year's Eve in the crowd. In a perfectly salient way of cutting through all the time between this instance and the last, we see that Hitomi is still largely inflicted with one of the main themes of Welcome to the NHK. She is chronically lonely. Where she wants Sato to, as it was in Literature Club, dote on her and follow her places, even if she also wants Sato to do more and actually acknowledge how much he values her and wants her, her current fiancé leaves her alone with her thoughts, which is quite obviously unhelpful for someone who is mentally ill and extremely medicated. Her fiancé is, paintedly, the anti-Sato. He represents the stability of the society, the worker, and the normal ideal man of Japan, and yet when it comes to true feelings in the Suicide Island, this New Year's Eve, she always thinks primarily of Sato. Sato is unstable, has no income, and has terrible social skills. He is awkward, he is terrible at conventional behaviour, and yet he, if he would just speak his feelings as opposed to treating her as his favourite radio host, would be the choice she would make every time these situations come up. She considers her situation in her detached and melancholy style as Sato watches her reflection in the glass. We get to watch the crowd through the window as Hitomi points out that nobody can get connection because of this crowd. Sato checks, and he cannot, and neither can Mizaki. Hitomi comments that it seems the call you don't want always makes it through. We can take this, per se, literally, and assume that Hitomi, yes, Hitomi, is talking aimlessly and not making a grander point. Or we can assume that she has not been lobotomized and venture to say that, as she would later call it a conspiracy, she is saying that the call was either planned or not real, or at least that she would find it believable that such was the case. Both would be ways to avoid spending time with Hitomi on the part of Jogasaki. Jugasaki has found a convenient excuse to abandon the mentally vulnerable Hitomi on a day for couples at night in a crowd. How pleasant. We get a wonderful piece of framing as she rests her head on her hand, Ring staring straight at the camera as it lingers, allowing us to have a thoughtful moment alongside our cast. She goes drinking with Sato. Importantly, this means that at this point in the show she is probably not pregnant. As much as elements of the commenters around Welcome to NHK may want you to believe, Hitomi ultimately tries to be responsible. She apologizes to Sato for her offline meeting, she behaves well in her office setting, wherein she is berated, and the only time we see her do anything reckless otherwise is that she drunk drives when she is already planning to commit suicide. From her other stated desires, Hitomi would value the chance to be relied on by something which actually values and needs her time. She makes the comment that the two have a connection, as they have bumped into each other frequently for people who do not often go outside. In this moment, we have a glimmer, a zircon in the dust, as Sato has once again been served up the opportunity to admit her importance. Sato asks if she is suggesting that it is a conspiracy, and Hitomi wistfully replies that they cannot know, as they are surrounded by so many conspiracies. She asks him to consider, for instance, a wedding, and suggests that that could be a conspiracy. She wears dread as a facial expression as she holds her head on her hand. The idea of a wedding with Jogasaki, here in this moment with Sato, is torturing her. Misaki, at this time, is still searching for Sato. She is on their trail and checks the cafe, but they're already gone, so we can roughly assume that Misaki is some time behind the two. Failing to keep Sato safe, she sits in a public square and is utterly crushed. He either didn't need her and is off on his own, or did need her and she has failed her objective and further failed Yamazaki too. In this case, she would have let everyone down. Hitomi, another restaurant entirely over, is still talking about the downside of her marriage and, specifically, the possibility of marrying the wrong person. Sato is, as ever, unable to make a genuine comment, and says that her current fiancé from the outside looks like a great choice. He makes a statement from a societal position instead of his own feelings, and Hitomi, ever the argument artist, breaks this down. Sato speaks as if he was talking to the average approximation of a human, rather than someone he knows personally and intimately. She comments that, looking at it objectively, there should be no problem at all, as she would be made for the rest of her life, and then she pauses with an empty smile, betrayed by her neutral eyes. Sato asks, "Isn't that what you want, though?" And once again squanders the moment. Once again, Hitomi continually gives Sato choices in this virtually one-for-one copy of the Culture Festival roof scene. He has been given the opportunity once more and agonizingly, again, he has said, "If you say so." Notably, she does not answer for a while and simply orders another glass, finishing her current drink. Hitomi always tries to follow the model society wants of her and, thusly, cannot really complain without breaking her persona. The ring is always in frame whenever an opportunity is given, despite the fact that she is openly unhappy with it. Every word is an attempt to get Sato, who on the island made the world's most tepid confession, to take a risk once in his life, and he absolutely, resolutely, will not. If he tries his best to actually engage with her, he may make mistakes, which he would regret. He is far more comfortable here in his current position, where it is safe and life just passes him by as he permits himself to feel blameless, slaving only over regrets he has already known. After a drink, her tone drops and she says that she doesn't know. She says, "It seems too good to be true. It must be a conspiracy." Sato further asks her if she is happy and she pauses again. Quite the pause, in fact. She says, dropped expression, that sure, she is happy, but that's why she is uneasy. Of course, situations following and given, we do not know whether she means in this specific moment, generally or otherwise to appease Sato, but considering the upcoming couple of scenes, I'm more inclined to believe that this response is about this specific moment of being with Sato and discussing almost freely like they used to. Considering the upcoming scene, I think it'd be difficult to argue that she is talking about her situation in general. Elsewhere, Misaki has recoiled into her hood, with her hair covering her face. She has retracted into herself with the failure of her goal. Hitomi says she never gets so drunk with Jogasaki as she can't let loose around him. After a few paces, she pauses in the middle of a wide alley with a sign for a love hotel at the end of it. She asks Sato if it is New Year's yet, then chuckling. She says she is bringing the new year with Sato, and Sato takes this mockingly before she starts to cry. The chuckle is bittersweet. She has attained something she wants, but the cost of getting to this point has been absurd. Sato recognizes none of the couple's aspect and still refuses to say anything. And just the effort required to get her to this point has her married to someone who avoids her, and who she can't relate to. But just in this one day, she gets to do this specific couple's activity with Sato. She is held in limbo between a life with Jogasaki, which translates to a long-term suicide pod, or continuing to struggle with futility, chasing her cowardly, pathetic, but genuine love interest. She cries and asks Sato if life is meant to hurt this much. Sato doesn't answer, and after a moment, she continues that, for her, it is painful. She has swung a hammer to the nail of the "Aren't you happy, Hitomi?" questions to clear up that she is in abject anguish over her situation. Sato, of course, will forget this as soon as possible. His inaction has broken her, and she asks him, now outright, if they should have an affair. The pretense, the social expectation, the entire thing has been ripped and thrown into the wind to give Sato what he wants, someone to ask him directly and deliver life on a platter. So many chances for Sato, no matter how obvious, have failed, and she, in this moment, gives up. Even now, though, Sato is stricken by inactivity and tentatively squeaks out a simple, "Yeah." Her gaze is locked on him, resolute, whereas Sato is paralyzed by the possibility of choice. Sato has been posed with his ultimate allergy: risk. We then move on to the most debatably occurring part of the show, depending on who you believe, what you believe, and what sort of timeline you think occurred. We see Sato and Hitomi go into a love hotel, Sato leading this time, with the goal to ask which room they should get, but unlike Sato's usual fantasy, Hitomi flips the choice back on him, telling him that she will leave it up to him. Hitomi has forced, even in this potential fantasy, the choice onto Sato if he actually wants to go forward. Even in this minuscule choice is a small victory. He asks her, inside the room, if it is okay, and she says, yes. As much as this is a weak answer in question, this is still engagement. She says that she has known for a while that he is the only one she really needs, a line which is perfectly in line with the things said prior, such as the event atop the Suicide Island cliff and so on. This brings up something interesting later, in the contrast of this more stoic and muted Hitomi who acts as we expect her to, and the later Hitomi who is laughing and amused but also tragically aware. This scene is ended with the New Year's poppers, and we are led to believe this event occurred within his mind, as they are importantly back on the exact opposite side of the alley to the love hotel. The Sato we see now is aware of what is holding him back, and yet is too still afraid of having to make a definitive choice. Let's try to parse whether or not this condensed timeline is more sensical than them having gone into the love hotel though. In situation 1, they do not go into the love hotel, and this scene is simply another figment of Sato's imagination, considering what would happen if he says yes. In this case, Hitomi has to stand there, silent, for however long it takes between her posing her question and the poppers going off. If this is a short time, she becomes vastly more sober in an unreasonably brief amount of time, as we get a more salient and piercing Hitomi when we return, and Sato, only moments later, asks if she is happy after being told, quite literally, no, twice. If it was a longer period of time, Hitomi had made no comment as she stood before a catatonic Sato. Alternatively, in situation 2, they went into the love hotel, did whatever they did, had a moment of admitting their feelings, and then sober up over this expanse of time before going back outside. Sato, after having had time between this and the last conversation, forgets much of what she had said prior in order to practice avoidance under the guise of a noble act of sacrificing the current for the sake of her relationship with Jogasaki. The best thing about this scene is the show works either way, so ultimately it doesn't matter which you believe happened. On one hand, the scene coming up is self-denial, which ultimately will hurt Hitomi under the auspices of a noble consideration of her relationship, serving only as avoidance in actuality. And on the other, the scene is a crushing coming to reality after admitting their feelings. Sato, if the events of the love hotel are believed, reverts to his avoidant cowardice and denies his feelings again to not have to reckon with the events which would occur thereafter. Either way, Sato asks, deep down, you're happy, aren't you? The tragedy of this question being posed again is not lost on the viewer, as this is something he has repeated after being told quite openly no twice this episode. She responds with a confused and pauses, following on with a soft nod and a Sato cannot look at her directly. In both situations that had happened prior, this is the ultimate act of avoidance, and whereas someone else may get angry, Hitomi has never been one to do so. Even when, earlier, Jogasaki cancelled on her last minute, she shrugged off the situation with the cover of the conspiracy. Sato continues. He says, we shouldn't be here like this. It's what the evil organization wants. And after initial surprise, she smiles. The facade has returned as well as her neutral expressions. I would, as a situation 2 believer, generally say her more accepting and less crushed behaviour may be a result of sobriety, paired with being aware that Sato does in fact value her and desire her, but is just too pathetic to make the required leap. Her desires all along have been to simply be desired, to be valued, and whether or not Sato is actively participating, at least the situation 2 Hitomi is aware that she has those traits, and they allow her to continue on. Sato's face is a forced smile covering a sea of sadness as she says, we are about to be caught up in another conspiracy. She walks to him and holds him arm in arm, and asks to walk like that to the station. Hitomi, rejected even, still wants at least some part of a relationship with Sato, even if it is just the image of one for an insignificant amount of time. She says that it is to fool the organization so that they think that she and Sato fell for the conspiracy. Sato, of course, doesn't believe this, and this medicated and now more sober Hitomi is aware of this too, but translating this, she is asking Sato if they can pretend to be a couple in this moment to partake in a different reality for just this meaningless iota of time, fooling themselves for a fleeting moment of the ideal. This willingness to engage in the image of the relationship, pushed by Hitomi, goes to show her genuine interest in Sato as a real romantic partner as opposed to just a sexual one as some cynics may have you believe. This departure is one of the most quietly crushing scenes in the entire show. We can't stop the suffering there though, so we, the audience, get another swift kick while we're already down. They walk to reveal that Misaki had been watching behind them and stands now, aghast. One may note that to not notice her approach would be odd, as she has approached from the direction Hitomi and Sato came from, which is the direction Hitomi is looking in directly for the entire duration of the conversation they have. And later, when we hear Misaki say that they came out of the Love Hotel, that injects a lot more questions about which one is the real set of events, as far as we know, the two have been standing entirely still for several minutes, at least as long as Misaki would have seen them for. After some distance, they stop at a small bridge over traffic, and Sato's vision is somewhat hazy. Scene work or meaningful, who knows? Sato, regardless, is still in some level of delusion, as we later see Hitomi fade into the crowd like the spectre of girlfriends past. Hitomi suggests that in 10 years they should have a literature club reunion with Yamazaki too, because surely by then they'll be happy with who they are. One may remember all the questions about whether or not she is happy deep down and so on, and wonder whether Sato deserved another no answer. And the answer is yes. In totality, this is Hitomi giving up. She is waving the white flag. She has tried to, at every junction, have a relationship with Sato, and been rejected at each one. She tells Sato that the next time they see each other, the evil organization and the conspiracies will be a thing of the past. Once again, the salient Hitomi declares that this is the moment of letting go of the past. Also, further, if they did go into the Love Hotel, 10 years is probably how long it will take for the organs to subside, since the last time they had sex, they didn't see each other for a further 4 years. We then get the odd news that she'll be a mother soon, despite seeing in 10 months' time she has what seems to be a newborn. Psychic, planning, or Love Hotel, the viewer will decide. Generally, I'd assume planning because 1. She was drinking on this day, 2. We see her swaddled newborn in 10 months, and 3. The newborn has Jogasaki's hair colour, which doesn't mean as much as we'd think with lighter hair on children becoming darker hair later in life, but it is likely an indicator from the anime, so I'm willing to believe Gonzo. Oddly, Sato congratulates her, which, considering that I've read all of the available chapters of Rebuild, is specifically odd. I'd, from reading Rebuild, assume that this means the Love Hotel did happen, as the mere idea of Hitomi having sex with another man in Rebuild makes Sato violently ill. Hitomi evaporates into the crowd, formless, and Sato finds Misaki in the train station. He lies to her, telling her that he was drinking, and when caught out from being broke, he lies again, saying that a businessman bought him a drink, and he says that he and Misaki should go to the shrine so they can pray for a good year. But, having seen her shut in with Hitomi, Misaki says there is no point, as if there is a god, he is probably too evil to help. It is interesting to note the lengths Sato goes to in this to avoid mentioning Hitomi, as Hitomi is not an unknown character to Misaki at this point. The hard avoidance of even commenting on the true series of events with such an odd story would further suggest to me that something less than wholesome had occurred between Sato and Hitomi to warrant Sato's unwillingness to discuss with Misaki. After a silent rail journey, she says that since he got lost the results were invalid, and they will do a makeup test later. His independent voyage with Hitomi rendered her aid pointless, her sense of purpose obliterated before her. Misaki, at home, stares at the ceiling, caught up in her own past. She states that she is not useless, and that Sato needs her as she considers the abuse she faced as a child. The next day, Misaki tries to soothe her mind, saying that Sato cannot feed himself without her, as she brings him food only to find out that Yamazaki has said that he'll provide Sato with enough cheese and milk to sustain himself. When she asks if this means that she is not needed, Sato says that there are gods of give and take, and, purpose robbed of her again, she runs away. Sato sees her upset and comments only that she could have left the food she brought him. Misaki makes it to the next counseling session, only to find the cat that she usually feeds has died, at which she just stares blankly. Sato helps her make a grave for the cat. At this point, Misaki has been beaten down by circumstance. Her chosen topic is God, and Misaki goes over the classic Schopenhauer, the sum total of human experience is overwhelmingly negative idea, and says that more than 90% of people's lives is spent in displeasure. She says that the God who created such a thing cannot be a good person. She blames Sato's shut-in status on God, and then says the prior mentioned line that it is God's fault that she saw Sato and Hitomi come out of the Love Hotel. Sato also puts in minimal effort to correct this if it is not the case, so he is of little help parsing the truth. Misaki says this means she must overthrow God. She further says that if she believed, she could blame everything bad on God, and that would let her feel like it wasn't all her fault. And with that, tears begin to waterfall. Sato, passive now too, sits and watches. He reflects that with Yamazaki and Hitomi both gone, Misaki is probably right, and that 90% of life is spent in misery. Misaki, at home, says that the plan is fine, and that she will continue onward. Sato is still her captive. Note that by the end of the series, this is genuinely the case, but she is also, therein, Sato's captive. Misaki, dejected, continues her plan, and the next day is also at the counselling spot. She mumbles about the Grated Yam's suicide note to herself, and plans out the order of events that we will later see occur in episode 24. The plan she creates allows Sato a chance to come after her if he denies Contract 2, as he has given the information contained within the context of the Grated Yam's suicide note. This is also why she is so happy to tell Sato where she's initially from. The mumbling is actually a super underappreciated plot point, as it shows just how prescient her planning really is, as either way this day goes, her plan continues, even into the bittersweet ending we witness occur in the show itself. Sato arrives and asks if she is okay. She says it is nothing, and that she is fine. She gets a tepid okay in response, and Misaki continues as if he said something actually considerate of her feelings, and says, "No really, it's nothing," to which Sato tells her to get on with it, because he's cold. Misaki is plunged into deeper dejection, blown off by Sato again. She wants to talk today about some famous people's dying words. Sato tries to be funny but fails. He gives in and gets the third answer of the quiz correct, that being Osamu Dazai, of No Longer Human fame. Relevance to this show obvious. He further gets the athlete question right too, making Misaki glad for a reason unknown to Sato. But this is the Grated Yams quote, which is important to her plot. The most Pyrrhic victory has been granted to Misaki. This athlete had killed himself after returning to his hometown and eating some homemade grated yams, and Misaki says that it is reasonable for people to want to see their hometown before they die. It is at this point that Sato thinks to ask if she is originally from Tokyo. The answer is no. She is from a seaside house next to a pleasant jetty on the western side of Japan, a jetty which a celebrity had sullied by throwing themselves off of, making it a popular suicide spot. This, further, makes it a navigable spot to go to by taxi when Sato later chases after her. She tells Sato that he has a graduation exam, and that she is going somewhere far away. She tells him he doesn't want to know where it is, as it doesn't matter to him, and he pauses. He asks where, and she says that it is a faraway town nobody knows about, and at this point, Sato's will runs dry. He simply says, "I see." A simple further question would have went so far in this moment, with Sato wanting her to remain at all, but Sato simply accepts not knowing where she will go. They, the day after, recreate their practice date. The dream of Sato doing anything for Misaki, which he could not do for Hitomi, is ultimately futile. Sato is not capable of reaching out to help another. They sit to eat a burger, and this time, Sato smokes regardless of the discomfort it puts Misaki through. He doesn't hold her hand, and they stand quite a distance apart, strangers in the crowd. He, thusly, passed the final exam, and she says that her project has been completed. Sato asks why he was picked, and Misaki just admits that she has a view into his apartment from her house, and she chose him because he was someone more worthless than her. She presents him with a new contract. Takimoto has decided that we have not suffered enough. This new contract's terms are that he will like her, he will not dislike her, and that he will stay with her whenever she is lonely, and because she is continually lonely, he will need to be with her at all times. The house on the hill makes sense. She is alone and has only been observing those around her at a distance. There is an inherent level of distance she wants to cross due to her childhood trauma, and this contract is her reaching out, begging Sato to save her. She has done her best to save Sato, and now she is pleading, standing before him, for him to return the gesture. She smiles sadly, saying that if he tries to treat her kindly, she will do the same, and that she has done the best she can to help him and has been completely devoted to him. Surely, by this point, he is crazy about her. We know, however, that she has been in her own shoes all day. Her head hangs low, her words lacking confidence. The reality that Sato is totally self-absorbed and only able to care as far as his own well-being goes in this moment is apparent. Call it manipulative or not, the mutual parasitic relationship Misaki is asking for is ultimately based on benevolent grounds. Can you really call it unhealthy if she is simply a broken person who wants to be better? And what is wrong with wanting to help the other broken, shut-in person be better, supportive moment after supportive moment at a time? Sato, however, in typical fashion, rejects this, considering that he ultimately failed to save Hitomi, even though he either came close to or started to and then gave up immediately depending on your view episode 22. What chance did Misaki really have? Misaki asks why not, as she is the only person Sato has left. She says that if he does not, he will be alone forever. She pleads with Sato's self-absorption, but thoroughly underestimates Sato's will to not engage with others. Hitori Bochi by Pearl Kyodai stings. The whole scene hurts. The sky fades into a muddy pink. The sun of the series has set. Now, Sato has no fear of the rejection or mockery. He has simply retreated into the safety of inaction and avoidance, and turns down every opportunity posed to him. He is dead on his feet. Like he said in episode 14 on the boat back, he has chosen to not live or die, but to simply not be. He will follow the path of least resistance, exerting minimal effort or action. If he did go with Hitomi to the Love Hotel, he managed to walk that back too. He took his moment of risk, pushed back regret for a moment, and retreated into the safety of his shell. Why step outside? He already did that. And now he's back inside, and safe, with the perceived lesser reward for any possible future action. He has nothing now to go towards which is worthy in comparison considering the possibility of future regret after such an action. His inaction has engulfed and hurt the woman he originally loved and who, ultimately, loved him back. So why now would he take a further risk for someone whose original intention was to look down on him, who is now asking to be around him continually? He can moralize not exposing them to him to justify his avoidance much easier. Misaki tells him that she will fall apart without him in pure desperation, and Sato disregards this, raising his voice, telling her that she will be just fine, and then following that up by telling her to, dismissively, do some yoga exercises because a cute girl like her can have a great life without someone like him. Of course, considering the things Misaki has told him moments prior, this is again Sato talking to the approximation of a human, rather than the person before him who he genuinely knows personally. As much as this action may wear the vestiges of a noble or charitable action in saving someone from having to be around someone as lowly as him, this is as self-serving of an action as those he took with Hitomi outside the Love Hotel. He is intent on not doing anything active to better his so-called friends. If his presence helps, so be it, as long as they come to him, but if he has to actively go to them, he cannot. He is intent on not acting, and will not, at this point, be swayed. Misaki, still desperate, asks him if he's lonely, and Sato denies such. As much as this is a lie, he is comfortable saying it to get out of helping Misaki. She continues that she cannot take this, and doesn't want to be lonely, to which Sato begins to run, telling her that he is not lonely, and to leave him alone. The final parting broadside is Misaki exclaiming that she does not believe him, crying. Sato, at home, tries to lie to himself and say that he is not lonely before he delves into another hallucination. He finally admits to Purine that he is lonely, but says that he cannot help Misaki as he doesn't have the right to, as someone of his station. He then hallucinates all of his friends berating him in order, telling him to admit that he is a failure. He lies with his head on the table the entire time. Thusly, he resorts to absolute inaction. He reverts. His house becomes a mess, and his parents call to tell him that they'll be cutting his allowance entirely. Yamazaki also finds it too difficult to send food to Sato, so Sato stays at home, laying on the ground starving. He sits there, thinking of food. He considers Misaki, who if he had simply accepted would have given him the lifestyle he desires. It is not his lifestyle or disorder, in this case, which holds him back. It is his lack of willingness to try, or do, or to attempt at all. Sato begins to starve and hallucinates Misaki going to feed him, and becoming further and further away, and instead of reaching for Misaki, he reaches for the food. He wants the supply back, but cannot bring himself to go and do the decent thing and help his needing friend. Instead, avoiding the real human relation, he decides to reach out for the work magazine and gets a job directing traffic. Sato waxes about the hikikomori lifestyle as a luxury, as, unless you're prepared to die, without the essentials, there is no choice but to work. Importantly, the work Sato does is not important or productive, and the light novel goes even further in explaining this, saying that the jobs he took were night shift mainly and most of them were far away from any human habitation, seeing a car go by on a straight road and waving his light stick as nothing more than a glorified traffic cone. He does so little productive in this job that the light novel has Sato say that it felt about the same as when he was in his apartment. Further, Takimoto expresses the inability to starve to death instead is in some form a personal failing. Quote, "After all, I had even tried to starve myself to death, but that had proven to be impossible. A weak-willed person like myself couldn't carry through with something like a fast." Unquote. Misaki is still, this entire time, watching, hoping that Sato would come to save her. At any point he could have done so, but he simply fails. An interesting factlet is that his job is still the path of least resistance. It is the method by which Sato mimics Jogasaki, wherein he does not have to engage with the difficult human emotions he has fostered in those around him. The job is, importantly, not a saving grace for Sato, it is merely more avoidance. Does Jogasaki's continual avoidance become better because he has a job to do instead? No, of course not. That's part of the problem itself. Sato is permitted to live a hollow life with the job in the same fashion as without, and this is evident in the light novel and anime. Many viewers genuinely perceive the job as a positive, which is beyond me. Maybe because I've read the light novel, but the job is the purest, least productive form of avoidance. He cannot even contemplate properly his situation while having the job because it distracts entirely and is socially acceptable. It grants no purpose, but will make Sato too tired to think about that lack. At least starving to death, I will wager, would have been a definitive choice made by Sato. Eventually, an ambulance shoots by and Misaki is wheeled out of her house on a stretcher. This is the first time in a long time that he has ventured to Misaki's house or, it seems, thought of Misaki at all. In the anime, she had slit her wrist in an attempt to kill herself. In the light novel, she had tried to overdose on pills. He goes up onto the house one day and runs into her uncle, who happens to be the landlord of Mita House, explaining why Misaki knew so many identifying details about Sato. We find out that Misaki's birth father died when she was young, and she gained a cruel stepfather. Thusly, Sato realizes why raising his fist to her was not pleasant. Apparently, she had become more cheerful after meeting Sato and talks about him happily. Her uncle asks him to be a friend to Misaki, and that stings. We have seen, for the past few months, Sato being anything but, neglecting his friend who was wallowing in sorrow, needing Sato's help as he did anything he could do to avoid doing so. The two have ventured to visit Misaki in the hospital, but she is not there. There is only a suicide note in the style of the Grated Yam's suicide note. Instantly, Sato leaps into action. He has been posed with the result of his inaction and he does not like it. We, as the viewer, may view it as a personality flaw that Sato required such a drastic wake-up call. He takes the suicide note and runs at a full dash to the train station to rush to her home in the west before she can carry out her suicide. We get a beautiful montage watching Misaki, bandaged wrists aboard a train, gazing longingly through the window as the train rushes ever further from Sato. The final episode leaves out the intro and opens with Sato's mind churning. Regret, once again, has Sato in its grips. He had managed to lock it away with avoidance, but avoidance only makes regret stronger when it next appears. He wonders what he would say to stop Misaki as he considers her earlier pleas for help with loneliness. A taxi takes him to the jetty, with the driver believing that he is going to commit suicide. He comments, offhand, that the construction is complete, so it doesn't matter. This episode is so devoid of fun and whimsy that the intro, even the hot mix, is too upbeat. The intro has been sacrificed in the mad dash to save Misaki, or alternatively, Misaki's dash towards death. Sato struggles through the snow, along a poorly marked path towards the peak of the jetty. He finds only an empty spot. He wonders if he passed her, or if she had already jumped as he tries to smoke a cigarette and fails. Every detail of the journey haunts him. Sato has shown that he is only willing to put in action at the most extreme of points. Hitomi was willing to cover for his failings, pretending to be happy, and thusly gave him an out. But now, Misaki refused to play his continual game, and he could not allow that. Harking back to his reason for going to the counselling so much earlier in the show, what would everyone else think if something bad happened to Misaki? And further, he doesn't want it to come to harm in the first place. It is only these extremes, however, that can push Sato into motion. Mere suffering can be ignored, even if it is openly his fault. He will say some platitudes and pretend like they should be fine, but given the most extreme, regret has no ability to be walked back. Sato stares at a broken railing and wonders audibly if he had missed her, and she responds. She was sitting on a bench behind him as he arrived only 5 minutes after her. She had stayed silent because he too had not said anything. He tries to convince her to go home and fails. He tries to convince her that, much like Hitomi, she's secretly fine. He, of course, has been able to put off thoughts with avoidant work, but this, of course, distracted him and did not change or fulfill his ultimate goal. He stands before her, the same Sato as ever, paranoid, anxious, and desperate. He tries to blame her for expenditures that he has racked upon the journey here, and so on, and Misaki simply apologizes, saying that she should have died yesterday as planned. She explains that she views herself as a curse because of her mother's suicide, and further, when her stepfather tried to get rid of her, his luck went bad. Even her aunt's missionary work declined, as well as her relationship with Misaki's uncle. She tried to counsel Sato in hopes of having one person who didn't think she was a burden, but even that failed. Sato graduated her counseling and then rejected her. Her project had fallen through. Sato accuses her of placing the magazines and note with the objective of having him follow her, but she says that she never expected him to catch up. She was glad to see that he did, and even when resigned to her death, she still had that romantic intention and love for Sato. But ultimately, the note was left so the question of whether or not she had meant to kill herself was concrete, unlike her mother's passing. She sits atop a railing, making intense eye contact, and silence falls. Sato has run out of things to say. His act fails, and he resorts to begging all too late. The dynamic has been inverted, and now he is the one pleading. Misaki, however, does not care how sad other people will be made by her suicide, and in a last-ditch effort, Sato finally tries to vocalize his feelings of affection. He really should have tried this earlier, by several months. He tells her he likes her, loves her, and begs her not to die. She just laughs. She has fully accepted her fate. Sato comes to terms with the fact that his words have no effect now. The interesting thing is that at basically every other point of the show, Sato's words were omnipotent. If at virtually any point Sato had said a single thing to either of his female love interests, he could have been with them. Hitomi could have been convinced to pack up and marry him instead, and for a lot of the show, Misaki could have been saved with a simple yes. For as long as Misaki had asked for nothing but his words, in the moment he chooses to utilize them, they mean nothing. The first time he speaks for his feelings, he has waited so long that only rejection waits for him. The thing he had feared so much was born out of his own cowardice. He could have averted slit wrists, and unhappy Hitomi, and most of the ills of the show, but now it is just too late. The feeling of helplessness has him consider if it is really so bad if Misaki dies, since in the end it is a question of when, and that being alive really is meaningless. He thinks back to the Schopenhauer pie chart, and that death is the way to avoid life's anguish. In this, he misses the point that a large amount of the suffering in the present for the time that pie chart was created was his fault. It was his string along with Misaki, while never acknowledging Hitomi, that had cursed them all to this moment. Rejecting the nihilistic paradigm of the favorability of death, he tells her that she cannot say that she is going to die, but she apologizes again, says goodbye, and falls backwards. A torii gate, the thrashing of waves, and a hat fluttering into the wind. We find that, at the last moment, Sato had chosen action and grabbed onto her, struggling to hold her up on land. His legs are shaking as he holds up her entire weight, leaning over the railing. Both will fall if anything goes awry. He hauls her up, holding her, and the gravity of her attempt dawns on her. Both realize their precarious situation. Sato then blames the current situation on the NHK in an attempt to fill the dead air to soothe the situation. Sato realizes that he should, instead of having been angry at Misaki, try to help her. It is one of the show's great tragedies that the character of Sato is so absorbed in his own persona that it took a second love interest suicide attempt before he came to terms with actually wanting to do nice things for the people around him. The job did not change that. Time did not change that. He came here angry, started angry like Yamazaki earlier, and that all meant nothing. It was the resolute action that he took, accepting risk and physically pulling Misaki from the brink of suicide, which finally broke through. Sato uses the NHK as a scapegoat for all of their and Hitomi's problems. He uses the coping method of your to help with the now, even though the girl who originated it suffered at his own hands via that coping method. He would have saved the day 11 episodes ago if he had just engaged with the girl who wanted to hear that there are conspiracies that he was willing to help with. But here we are in episode 24, and the girl he is trying so desperately to save now is a sad, traumatized woman who just wants someone to tell her that she is loved, wanted, and needed. Misaki looks concerned as Sato explains his conspiracy. He grabs his head and writhes, blaming it on a psychic attack by the NHK. He further explains that the NHK acronym has different meanings per person, and, despite the things he blames on the NHK for Hitomi and Misaki being things he caused or contributed to, pierces the veil to find the way he can still be the hero of this story. He says that all bad things originate from the NHK. He points to the edge of the jetty and declares that the enemy is at the edge and hallucinates a giant cog being, the same from the first episode. Sato says it's too late for him now, but that he will take down the NHK with the revolution bomb in a kamikaze attack. He dashes towards the end, saying that no matter what, he'll protect Misaki, and that she has to live a long and happy life. She tries to call out to him as he declares that this is his dying wish. He jumps over the edge, declaring his idiocy to himself, finally coming to terms with the fact that he loves Misaki, opening himself up to risk as he is supposed to fall to his death. He remembers with some spite Yamazaki telling him that they do not deserve a dramatic death, and mocks the thought, He throws off those shackles and goes with his own plan. From the start, from episode 1, that desire for a dramatic, meaningful death was the intention. As soon as he was given the opportunity, the progress, the status, and everything else dissolves away. In an extended version of the earlier quote, "This was all I had wanted. I always had intended to die. I would fulfill my own life's purpose and also save Mizaki. Truly, this was the clearest way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I was the one who had planned to die. I always had planned to die. After all, I even had tried to starve myself to death. But that had proven to be impossible. A weak-willed person like myself couldn't carry through with something like a fast. My limit was 4 days. Then, I had worked to earn my living expenses. That was the single time I had worked hard before my death. I always had been searching for some way to die." At the end, all he wanted was that dramatic death. He wanted to once more dissolve, to totally disappear, and do it in a way that he got to define. He looks at his normal phone as he falls and remembers something critical. The taxi driver mentioned construction. Mizaki calls out after him as he plunges. Sato, having made the first real choice, is negated by a suicide net. Yamazaki has been proven right once again. His vision of a dramatic death is so uninspired that someone has preempted it because too many people have already tried the same thing. Futility overtakes him as he is devoured by embarrassment, crawling towards the edge. He had a moment of honesty and mourns his dramatic death's passing. He knew full well that jumping was for no reason, but the goal of the drama and excitement had even been taken. For Sato, the NHK was the code for misfortune, that mockery and that feeling of embarrassment. For Hitomi, it was all of the things in her life that caused mundane suffering, the things that impeded having a normal life. Sato's definition is notably more acute because his problems were smaller. He just didn't want to deal with even the small ones. Mizaki looks over the edge, tears in eyes, at the pathetic Sato as he cries, simply hanging over the edge instead of going further. There is no romance in slowly rolling off of a suicide net. Mizaki helps him climb back up and she drags him further inland. She sits crying before the catatonic Sato of episodes past as the melancholy score etches into the wrinkles of your brain. The simplicity of the score captures very well the futility, sadness, and most importantly, the mundane nature of the experience we've just witnessed these 2 dragged through. She slaps his head, his knee, and in a mirror of Sato a few minutes prior, tells him that he cannot die. After a moment passes, they consider how to get home, but the snowfall stops them from getting home today. Mizaki suggests they go to her old house close by, which was built by her real father. She walks Sato around the house as he is the only person other than her parents to have been there because of her family situation. She asks him to tell her about himself, and Sato, struggling against the real and pressing question, quips that he will tell her a dream he had, repeating the Freud dream from earlier. They have a soft moment of comedy as Sato swaps to talking about his normal childhood with Mizaki falling asleep on his shoulder. Of course, in the anime we cut to the epilogue here, but in the light novel, this is where they sign Contract 3, and I personally think that's moderately more sensical, but I also really like the way the anime handles the ending. In the epilogue, however, we see a letter from Yamazaki. Yamazaki's letter is dated 07/03/10, the 3rd of October 2007. This gives us some important timeline information. This still leaves Hitomi's ending ambiguous. Since Sato gets both of these letters at the same time, or at least close enough to open them at the same time, it is unlikely for Hitomi to have been aware that she was pregnant at the Love Hotel, considering that she has a tiny swaddled baby, and swaddling generally stops anywhere between 2 and 4 months. Of course, it's possible, but this specific detail allows Hitomi's ending to be intentionally vague, as the timeline almost perfectly lines up with Hitomi's child being Sato's. But also he has the lighter hair, and it could have been the case that she knew if Hitomi had waited towards the usual ends of swaddling to send this picture. Yamazaki's letter, though, shows that he has had a successful arranged marriage. It is amusing to note, this is a choice at the behest of his parents that he is overjoyed about. Welcome to the NHK is a show dripping in irony, dark comedy, and the cruelties of life, but somehow, this one strikes particularly painful. Despite everything Yamazaki said in the show, he carried none of those beliefs over to his actual life. It is as if he was never even in Tokyo. Where the suicide attempt changed Sato, the resignation to his parents' will changed Yamazaki. The letter from Hitomi tells us that she is also reasonably successful and is written as spoken, but even this read aloud sounds marred with a twinge of subtle sadness. With this said, Sato still has a meaningless job, but now also goes to meter park each night. Now, he is teaching Mizaki as opposed to the other way around. He is tutoring her so that she can get into a college. Mizaki, at one of these, says that her NHK is different. Sato's noble sacrifice slayed the evil god, which for Mizaki is loneliness, not being wanted, not being loved, and otherwise. But in case that god ever tried to come back, she made her own NHK. This is Contract 3, called the Hostage Exchange Association. The gist is that neither can kill themselves because that would require the other two, thusly, kill themselves too. Further than that, the contract states that if they reach a point at which either party doesn't care if the other also dies, the point of the contract has failed, so the two will work to make sure that this doesn't happen. Therein, they will work to make each other happy and to make each other like the other. Contract 3 forces a stalemate, wherein they've declared their feelings for each other. They sign the contract and Sato dedicates himself to giving the contract and the required actions therein all he has to give. Mizaki says that now they have the contract, she is sure they will both be okay, and we finally hear the roll credits words as Mizaki welcomes Sato to the NHK. The ending is somewhat ambiguous and differs per medium. Some people, somehow, enjoyed the manga ending, which personally I view as too edgy and bombastic to be a really appreciable rendition of this great tale, whereas the light novel and anime both end on a soft relationship between Sato and Mizaki, with the two admitting their feelings and locking their lives together inextricably. They continue their old routine and of course, this time, Sato has actually signed the new contract which Mizaki, anxious, encouraged him to sign, likely with the memory of Contract 2 stapled to her psyche. The last few frames of the anime are carefully crafted and go to show that the romance of the early show has returned to their lives. In one of the most, if not the most, iconic images from this anime, we have Sato looking up at Mizaki, standing slightly above his crouched form, with big eyes and a gentle smile peering back at him. This is, a lot of the time, how we saw Mizaki in episodes 1 through 9. Sato has dragged himself back to a state somewhat akin to the literature club, and Mizaki knows that Sato loves her, wants her, and cherishes her. Sato can remain basically unchanging, and all Mizaki asks is that he doesn't leave or resent her. The new contract is arguably more involved than Contract 2, as it is more permanent and drastic. The only out now is death as opposed to a 10 million yen fine. It is important to note that despite both of them being in better places, the contract at the end signifies what is actually important to the characters through Takimoto's writing. Both have their independence and then discard it in favour of relying on each other for purpose, a way to feel whole in perpetuity. Sato is willing to make changes to better his life, to repel regret, because he can rely on that hope Mizaki provides. Sato is, at the end of the show, willing to live a life of intention rather than passivity, in service and unity to and with Mizaki. Is it codependent? Who cares? Both of these characters saw the opportunity and, despite Sato's total inability in the past to do anything of the sort, succeeded in making a long-term choice for their betterment. As we reach the end of the summation of events, I am left only with that hopeful continuation impression Welcome to the NHK leaves, as we have no information about what happens to our cast past this. Welcome to the NHK is unquestionably artistic. It's a pure expression of the thoughts and concept transferred from artist to viewer, and those ideas, whether you want to hear them or not, are definitely passed on. It is unquestionably heartfelt, as it is autobiographical fiction. It is inspired by Tatsuhiko Takimoto's own personality and actions, and the light novel became a confessional more than a story halfway through its production. More notably is the only difference between Sato and I is a name quote from the anime lockdown interview. Further, is unforgivingly realistic, unquestionably resonant with nigh billions of people who struggle with the motivation to simply move and traverse the outside at all, and what I think has Welcome to the NHK transcend all of its competitor works is the underlying, unrepentantly human story it tells. We hate Sato for his humanness. We love Sato for his humanness. We loathe him and cherish his flaws at the same time because of that raw humanness. Sato is eminently relatable, which is one of the reasons he can be so hard to watch at points a la David Brent. Yamazaki exists in another form. Who in the 2010s didn't know a Yamazaki? His rebellion, his stupid obsessive hobby, his resignation, his anger, all traits which could be flaws, but worst of all, traits which really do appear in so many people. Of course, we will discuss more as we move into the next part of this video, and now that we're all caught up to speed with the events of the show and their significance, and a good few of them have been dissected, we can move on to some more focused analysis. To any of you who have recently watched or re-watched the show, I am sure this was positively thrilling so far. Chapter 2. Each character's struggles. An analysis. Each of the characters we have focused on have their own issues. Watching their interactions, we are granted the ability to pick apart who has what sort of setback, and it is interesting, therein, to discuss each of them individually. I will, here, try to discuss them in order of shortest and easiest to discuss, to longest and most complex out of our main cast. Firstly, Yamazaki. Throughout the show, we see several ringing personality flaws in Yamazaki which can, at times, make him difficult to like. Yamazaki is primarily a terrible hypocrite. He tells Sato that Sato doesn't think about other people very often, while Yamazaki ignores his own contributions to the Suicide Island arc, pushes Sato to finish a pointless game for a goal that only he really has, and catfishes Sato on an online game, putting Mazaki through horror knowingly. This being said, he was dealing with Sato of all people, so it's hard to feel too irate about his actions, but throughout the show, Yamazaki does not treat Misaki very kindly at all, treating her as an extension of Sato that he cares very little for. Further, Yamazaki is prone to anger, physically attacking Sato over a snowball fight at one point, screaming down his phone at his parents, etc. We see lots of examples of a calmer Yamazaki, but when posed with something irritating, Yamazaki very quickly melts down into an uncontrolled rage. One can attribute this to any number of causes. Firstly, the fact that he is a foretold passenger in his own life with a stay of execution for the time that he is in Tokyo. This explains why he explodes whenever something is less than ideal in his temporary respite. We will touch on this in a moment. Secondly, we see that Yamazaki was bullied as a child, interrupted shortly by Sato, but we also see that Sato was Yamazaki's main friend for the year that Sato was still in the literature club. Sato, of course, was only there for a year, as he was in the year behind Hitomi, so when Hitomi left the year before Yamazaki joined, Sato leaves in the next. This leaves Yamazaki with a period of time unaccounted, where we can only assume that he returned to a state of friendlessness, considering we never see him with any other friends. His time is consumed by work, school, and Purin, and he is overjoyed to see Sato at the start of the show. Yamazaki is, ultimately, poorly socialized and becomes a bit of an alcoholic. Once again, it is easy to, at a glance, find Yamazaki's irritability and short temper to be off-putting, but considering his situation and the seeming failure of all adults in his life to give him a normal childhood, it's, roughly speaking, understandable. More to the direct point of Yamazaki's character, he's attempting to abdicate the trappings of his birth. Yamazaki, coming from a rural and older way of life, does not have the same fluid life plan set out for him as our new metropolitan masses and the like. Yamazaki has, effectively, been assigned a place and, struggling with this, has fled to Tokyo for a temporary reprieve. He chose video game design, something which is fundamentally, even more so in 2006, one of the most new-time professions possible. The old agrarian role he has been assigned to is the exact opposite of the new free-form job he is striving for through much of the series. The difficulties of being successful in the new world role as opposed to the ease and continuity of the assigned role ultimately proved too much for him. As much as I am sure Yamazaki, given the choice, would have rather his life turned out as an acclaimed games developer, he would have had to, when his father became ill, condemn the rest of his family to poverty as it fell on him to maintain the family farm. Further, it is something more solid. Dairy and cattle farming is something which people require as opposed to the ebb and flow luxury of gaming. It is further guaranteed to him based on the station he's been assigned by circumstance, while a career in game development is, at the end of the day, a gamble. We see the highs, posed earlier on in the show by Yamazaki, of riches and fame, but we also see the lows, posed in Winter Comic Market, where they have to discount their game to even sell 5 copies. It is somewhat sad that the mode of relating to people, when at the farm, Yamazaki finds is drinking, but the sense from his parents and others that he belongs there is, eventually, comforting. We see Yamazaki have the most pleasant ending of our main cast, deserved or not, because of the acceptance of that reintegration which ultimately led to his marriage. In conclusion, Yamazaki is stuck between extremes, the old and new, the jovial moments swinging rapidly into moments of rage, and moments of extreme consideration of Sato's situation to being wholly thoughtless. Yamazaki enables a lot of Sato's bad behaviour. He drinks to excess, and has no real solid ideals when it comes down to his own relationships, but he is, at the end of the day, younger than Sato and held in limbo throughout the duration of the show. We will now consider Misaki's situation. Misaki, being a subversion of the manic pixie dream girl trope, often either gets a very positive or negative perception. On one hand, she does manipulate Sato for her own gain. She spies on him, stalks him, and plans out how she will get things from Sato that she desires months in advance. This being said, all of this comes in the form of things which are good for Sato, or at least more preferable than his starting living situation. As much as initially, Misaki is simply using Sato as a delivery mechanism for someone to need her help, she does grow to love Sato over time and genuinely acts towards his benefit for the majority of the show in ways outside the scope of her initial mission. She, for example, works diligently to save Sato from the MLM, which otherwise one would consider would be a positive for his dependency on her. If he is even poorer, and thusly given the situation even more pathetic, she could surely translate that into a greater dependency, but Misaki, acting to help her friend and love interest, chooses not to do so. Personally, I think Misaki has the most straightforward character of our main group. Misaki's issues as of the current time are not specifically internal, but based on the actions and misfortunes of her parents. This does manifest in the current time as a lack of self-esteem and placing a lack of value on herself, which of course is internal, but the origin of these issues is specific, and we can point to and blame primarily her stepfather. Misaki, for people who have forgotten the plot of the show already, views herself as a burden on those around her, because that is what she had grown up being told, and that is the extrapolation she further took from her surroundings. Her father died shortly after her birth, her mother was suffered by her stepfather generally, and also in Misaki's defense, and we know that something further happened to her stepfather. Hopefully something fatal, I suppose. Potentially, one could place some blame for her current situation of total surrender to supposedly being worthless on her mother, who calmly threw herself off or mindlessly fell off the jetty in front of her when Misaki was just a small child, as we see in the flashback. I think that would be a bit uncharitable towards a woman who was being physically abused by an alcoholic, but it'd be hard to argue that having to witness such a thing didn't have prolonged and ongoing impact on Misaki's psyche. The Misaki we see in the current is still struggling with those feelings of worthlessness, the loneliness she has considered deserved for being so self-ascribedly unlovable and burdensome. This leads into the motivation for the whole show, wherein she chooses to try and find someone who will view her kindly, and for this, she wants to find someone more pathetic than herself so that, as we see in one of the counselling sessions, she can speak freely to that person without feeling judged or lesser than. Misaki effectively wants a human pet. She wants someone who can verbally tell her how much she is needed, how she is valuable, and she wants that person to stay in a non-threatening state to supply that for much of the show. This, of course, is basically what Sato wants too. He just doesn't want to have to say anything pleasant about her either. This dynamic, however, when upset for a moment, causes Misaki outright dejection. Misaki is perfectly happy to have Sato as a romantic partner, and to do good things for Sato, to have good experiences with Sato, to be nice to Sato. But when Sato ceases to supply her with that external source of value, she crumbles back into her former state. It's a sort of selfish altruism wherein Sato gets a concrete benefit and Misaki gets a psychic benefit. Both win, but it is transactional until the end of the show when Sato tries to enact a permanent message by jumping from the cliff, and she's finally willing to believe him when he says he values her. I'd love to say that Misaki deserves better at the end of the show, but ultimately, from the show we know that Sato isn't particularly undesirable, simply cripplingly cowardly. And this is a facet of his personality which, with the dying moments of the show, Sato shrugs off in favour of being with Misaki. How cute! The ending Misaki and Sato get, in their loving mutually assured destruction, isn't a full recovery to normal, but it would be unrealistic to expect that someone could be possible of making such a 180-degree recovery possibly ever in their life. And thusly I'm willing to say Misaki has a hopeful ending, which can, at a stretch, be called a good ending if we were to gloss over the whole slit-wrist suicide attempt turning into someone else's suicide attempt trauma that I'm sure they'll have lots of fun addressing in their inverse counselling. And speaking of the man, in a solid second place of most complex character, we have Sato, Takimoto's self-insert. One may wonder how Sato is in second, but all in good time. Sato is the character we have the most time in the head of through the show. We see the actions of the show through mainly his eyes, as we read the light novel from Sato's perspective too. We hear the rationalizations within Sato's head, whereas we do not have this for characters around him. We see the moments of Sato alone, and the suffering contained therein. Sato is our point of reference for the world for, I'd say, roughly 90% of the show. Sato's problems, because he can just outright tell us, are more easily broken up and dissected, so, in the goal of clarity, I will number them this time. Number 1. Paranoia. Sato, since college, has suffered from a constant paranoia that the people around him are judging his appearance, behaviour and personality. This evolves into a full social phobia, and a phobia of the outdoors over his years of being locked away in his room. Previously, in high school, this manifested itself in a cold and frosty demeanour, wherein Sato tried to put out the image of being uninterested and stoic. But this, of course, is further a manifestation of this paranoia. Sato uses this as a way of being able to not be judged for his thoughts and beliefs, and we only get to see a crack in his shell via the literature club, wherein we see moments of the current zanier and more excitable Sato, if you can call him that, when he is trying to interest Hitomi in the telescope, for instance. Even with Hitomi, though, Sato often keeps up those frosty defences, such as the night of the culture festival. We do see, however, that this earlier manifestation of his paranoia is less crippling. At the time, the cold exterior was enough to protect his image to allow him to go between his schoolmates. But of course, when the people he has to engage with are no longer simply people of the exact same station as him, he is more prone to believing that they are making judgments about him. The breaking point, he tells us, is on the way to university, being a more fluid and less horizontal standing structure. He had been overcome by the belief that the random people around him on the street had singled him out as a target of mockery and disgust. Sato's character therein, with his distance from other humans, is the most analogous to some of the media mentioned within the show. most notably No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, which we'll talk about later. Sato's paranoia is largely represented by these little blue guys who are continually laughing and jeering at him. He hallucinates these little fellows when in moments of extreme stress. Number 2. Avoidance. Sato's paranoia and personality at large feeds into his main problem throughout the show, which is his constant avoidant behaviour when it comes to action for the betterment of his life. This manifests in the hard tendency for Sato to always take the path of least resistance. Of course, if Sato does not act, it is hard for other people to judge him on his actions, and if he is not visible to those outside, they cannot perceive him to be able to mock him. When he does have to be perceived, he will try to don the vestiges of something more respectable than a shut-in to avoid further public mockery, and if that fails, Sato will simply retreat and melt into wallowing instead of making any sort of change. It is through this that we can largely assume that Sato is probably suffering with long-term chronic depression spanning much of his life, including his openly avoidant high school life, where his entire personality is avoidance. He goes so far as to pretend to have friends in conversation with his only real friend, Hitomi, as to both sound cooler and give himself an excuse for sitting in the literature club room alone. Where is Sato? Probably with his friends, and surely not retreating into silence so he can avoid merely existing around people. He is avoidant whenever she tries to engage with him on an individual-to-individual level, reverting to simply playing cards in silence as she struggles to talk to him about anything and get a real response. This is downstream from his paranoia, but has formed a totally separate issue. The burgeoning paranoia likely resulted in the desire to not be perceived, which creates the avoidant personality, and later the full-blown paranoid phobia develops as well. The two issues come from the same source, but manifest in different ways. In the current day of the anime, we see this manifest in a myriad of ways. Sato still fails to tell Hitomi how he feels about her. Sato fails to dedicate to the NHK. Sato tries to avoid counselling for the express goal of living a comfortable shut-in life by lying about his profession to Misaki. Sato avoids helping Misaki towards the end of the show and instead chooses the path of least resistance in the form of a meaningless job out of more avoidance, and countless more examples which would, if I listed them all, not be audibly pleasing, as long lists tend to make the listener forget what we had been talking about in the first place. We are introduced to his avoidance immediately in episode 1, where he can't even bring himself to go next door and tell his neighbour to turn down his loud, obnoxious music. Avoidance is Sato's biggest enemy, paired with... Number 3. Regret. Sato, throughout much of the show, is a slave to regret. We see many instances of Sato being pinned down by his regrets in moments wherein he should say or do something. He is frequently, in his moments of contemplation, mulling over some high school regret. He is terrified of future regret and the possibility of making more regret for himself, as we see with his motivation to meet Misaki for counselling. This feeds his avoidance. If he doesn't act, he can't create more regret. Even if that means being forever stricken by the same old regrets in perpetuity, hiding in a tiny apartment to avoid ever having to struggle with the past, present, or future. Sato has become acceptant within his helplessness. His failure has defined his current for so long that he does not mind being a perpetual victim of his own prior actions. Consumed by the failings of the past and his perceived oncoming failings of the future, he accepts his position and station in life, to be the failure. Once again, to, as mentioned earlier, let it rot. Number 4. The Veil of Nobility. This aspect is somewhat harder to explain, as it is a developed trait Sato gains later on in the anime, notably after he's berated on the edge of the Suicide Island's cliff. Many of Sato's actions, with outcomes indistinguishable from those which occurred or would occur prior to the Suicide Island, after that event were shrouded in the framing of a noble intention, usually under the guise of self-sacrifice. Yamazaki's speech seems to have moved him from wanting one large show of devotion or drama to many little insignificant deaths that he can display whenever he wishes to be avoidant but make it seem like he's taking the harder choice by denying himself. This occurs with Hitomi outside the Love Hotel, Misaki in Contract 2, Hitomi after the Suicide Island, and even between himself and his furniture. This is also partially what occurs with his job later on. While he is waxing philosophically about the luxury of being a hikikomori, he is still avoiding the actions he ought to be doing, those being helping Misaki after so much has already been done for him. One may get the wrong idea from this part of the show and Sato's arc, but his supposedly noble and respectable act of getting a job is, as earlier said, more avoidance. One could be fooled into thinking that he is doing something for his betterment, but this is simply not true. He is doing the easiest path, taking an action of not being present in the present, consigning difficult tasks of emotional labour to some nebulous future time. Every moment is filled with tedium to stave off the question of whether or not he should be doing something else. As stated in the light novel, this tedium is so mindless that it imparted the same feeling as being a shut-in. Sato no longer has the uninterrupted time for contemplation, and the acceptable loop of work, sleep is almost identical to his prior life as a shut-in, but with no reason for people to check in on him or inject themselves into his situation. His life is still vapid. In fact, his life skips by so quickly that the next month or so is summarized by only a couple of frames. His life has become emptier than his time as a shut-in. He is doing better with hygiene and cleanliness, sure, but his life has become even more devoid of any actual notable event or goal. He has to make less decisions than before, not more, as his daily routine is planned out for him. The idea that Sato, who is plagued by the inability to make meaningful choices and regret, is viewed as recovering by so many viewers because it is relatable is upsetting. The proposition that because it is a normal way for humans to avoid their problems it is fine is much the problem that is punctuated by Mizaki's following suicide attempt. Not only does he passively waste time in his employment, but he also managed to almost kill the only person who still wants him around in the process. There is an uncharitable and surface-level view of Welcome to the NHK, which says the show boils down to, get a job, shut-in. But to reach this conclusion, one would have to pay the true minimum of attention or view the show as entirely self-congratulatory if one is employed while watching it. Sato does not have the capacity to do both the job and the right thing. Thankfully, he gets a second chance to do the right thing and chooses to do it, and then returns to his job. But if the job had continued to come prior to the right thing to do, the right thing to do would never have been completed. Ducks in order, and so on. Sato, in conclusion, tries to, in the second half of the show, avoid doing what should be done by masking his avoidance under a layer of acceptability. Finally, we have Hitomi. Hitomi is here at the end of the cast, primarily because she's a conflicted character. Much of the community discussion around Hitomi is overwhelmingly negative, which I, personally, as well as the people I have mercilessly forced to watch this show in the past couple of months, find to be very unfair. On one hand, whenever she is in Sato's life, she seemingly makes it worse. First, she imparted him with schizoid beliefs about the mysterious NHK conspiracy. When she reappears, she wedges between Sato and Mizaki, and then she takes him to a suicide island. On the face of it, these seem quite bad. However, it is important to note that none of this was intended. The Literature Club was an unmedicated Hitomi trying to form a genuine connection with another human being, and one which we find she had feelings for all along, with quite obvious reciprocal feelings that they would not admit. It was a time wherein she was trying to make the ideas she had conveyable to the person she was interested in, within the perceived confines of societal norms, however poorly that went. She re-enters Sato's life and tells him, immediately, that she wishes they had dated. Again, this is not malicious, and is possibly the most important turning point of the first half, bringing Sato back in line with reality. The things she says are genuine and are a major factor in Sato moving from delusion to exploring his regret, but also exploring her regret. As much as Sato is a slave to regret, Hitomi is also. Hitomi, however, is far more salient about her regret, and tries to, within the confines of social acceptability, combat the regret she still walks with. Her actions to most people would have been more than enough to elucidate her feelings towards her fellow Literature Club member, but unfortunately for her, she was paired with Sato. Regret raised its head for Hitomi again before the offline meeting, and even then she plans on visiting Sato first to try and redo the Culture Festival day, but this time to do it well. She tells the group that she is visiting an old friend and that she may not make it, in which case to go without her. She has, in this, allowed herself the option to succeed with Sato in absolutely transparent wording as, they are not coming back from the island. If things go well with Sato, she will not be killing herself. Allowing herself the possibility of living and further openly stating it on the island, Hitomi does not want to kill herself, but believes that the circumstances around her life have prevented her from having that normal, peaceful life she dreams of. On the island blaming the conspiracy, but in coming to meet Sato as the means of preventing her suicide, tacitly lays blame on Sato and his passivity. Blaming schizophrenic, bipolar, depressed Hitomi for desperately trying to connect and be recognized by the boy she loves, who she knows has reciprocal feelings that he, for some reason, just will not say, is insane, especially considering how far she goes in trying to express that she would be interested and willing. If Sato had said anything to affirm her at any point over the countless opportunities, even atop the cliff as she is proposed to, we can see from the prior few moments that she would probably accept Sato over her would-be fiancé. Here, we see again, with any word, Sato gets a happy ending. Maybe without employment, and maybe with some extra explaining and help given to poor Mizaki, but the story would be over. A word saves Hitomi and gives Hitomi the opportunity to try to save Sato, but as is the case through their entire story together, Sato is to blame for his inaction again. The events which it is common to see Hitomi blamed for are, realistically, created by Sato and Sato alone, maybe with some minor help by Yamazaki. Thereafter, some people will try to suggest that Hitomi was merely using Sato as a vessel of attention which she really wanted from her current boyfriend, with Sato as a stand-in. I think this interpretation is actively uncharitable. If this was the case, why, in the idealized damsel version of herself she writes about in the suicide forum, does she imagine Sato as her boyfriend and not Jogasaki? Why even go to Sato before the suicide island? And why give an out for specifically Sato to interrupt her suicide plans? Why does she later spend all of New Year's trying to convince Sato that she does not want to marry Jogasaki and continually try to squeeze any interest out of him in place of that marriage? Sato is, continually, the regretted object of desire. The regret plot line is so much more painful than merely "people around you might use you" that viewing Hitomi in this stretched, unfavourable light cheapens the plot. The plot shows us their old regrets haunting them, most of which are inescapable, causing new regrets as they fail the present based on the past, which only makes them feel those old regrets more. Act on the regret half-heartedly, and they fail. Do not act on those regrets, and they will regret that too. The only solution would be to fully act on the regret, but Sato does not have the capacity to do that, and it would be socially unacceptable for Hitomi to be forward enough to satiate Sato's need for inaction. Hitomi is held in limbo by Sato's personal failings, and no matter what she does, throughout the show, she cannot escape the bind she and Sato have been placed in since the literature club. Sure, at the end of the show we see Hitomi with a house and a child, but to look at the postcard and assume, "Ah yes, Hitomi got a good ending," would be to assume the shoes of Sato in episode 22. To make that assumption, you would have to read it from the view of someone who is an approximate human, and not the Hitomi we have witnessed. When pressed, Hitomi says that she is happy regardless of how dejected we see her about her current situation. For example, saying that she is definitely happy deep down after confiding in Sato that life hurts for her in a fleeting moment of her usual finely crafted mask slipping. As much as one can assume Hitomi, who wants to be wanted, would probably be happy with a dependent child, she had already outlined the draft of her current life in the bar with Sato, which didn't seem to make her much happier. Hitomi's end, ultimately, is still in limbo, but now is openly denied a resolution since the literature club reunion is so far away, she has additional responsibilities, and Sato is with a woman who is not herself. Hitomi, if we are not to take the postcard as written, but consider what we have seen in episode 12, 13 and 22, has the worst ending out of any character in the show bar maybe Kobayashi, and poor Hitomi deserves none of it. Sato may be able to, at the end of the show, stave off his own regret and begin moving forward, but, much like Yu Kobayashi left his sister in a lifelong bind to finally attain his normalcy, Sato has condemned Hitomi to an unsolvable regret in the attaining of his own forward momentum. Hitomi, on the face of her own character, is competent but cold. She wants to be able to have more impact at her workplace by solving issues, but her ideas are shot down because solving the problems she wants to is not her job. She has an icy exterior which carries on throughout most of her actions in the story. We see this in her earlier life too, and whether we can attribute this to mental illness, cultural roles expected of a beautiful woman, or Hitomi wearing a perpetual mask for any number of reasons that she only really drops around her one interest, Sato, at times like the Culture Festival and New Year's, we can assume that she gains at least some psychic benefit from not being continually judged on her conspiracy power level being publicly visible. If Hitomi was purely interested in attention, I do believe that she would, occasionally, drop the silent exterior. But considering the Hitomi we see, I think it's safe to say that she's not interested in attention in the absolute. We see the one office guy try to pour attention onto her with no effect. We know Jogasaki does not even get to see a fully let loose Hitomi from episode 22. Only Sato knows the undiluted Hitomi beneath the exterior. Personally, I think that makes it only more tragic that, being exposed to the real, needing, lonely Hitomi, Sato refuses to enact any action that would allow the two of them to have a relationship at all points of the show. I find Hitomi to be such a compelling character for Sato's backstory because of the role she portrays. She is someone that Sato could have easily helped, and simply didn't. As much as I will later talk about Welcome to NHK's role as a mirror, I think the regretful view of someone you should have done better for is almost universal if you've had at least a good few human relations and an appropriate level of introspection. Of course, the show has had many moments of Kierkegaardian do or do not, but I cannot help but feel the parable it tells via the medium of Sato and Hitomi's story is that at least do leaves you with concrete and finite regrets. Do not, as Yamazaki says, leaves nothing but vague anxieties that are never really resolved. I will conclude this section by saying that Hitomi deserved better, even if that better, for the Hitomi who just wants to be told that she is wanted, with Sato, who wants to put in as minute of an effort as possible, may have been far less than ideal. At least it would have been a chance. Chapter 3. What would have been, if Sato had any impetus to act, the happiest him? What can we learn from Sato? I would like to take a short detour and talk about Sato and happiness. In totality, Welcome to the NHK is not a story about attaining happiness. It is a story about attaining the will to keep moving, But if we, for a moment, forget the artistry and reason for writing and take it as a pure story, what would be the moment at which Sato, in the story, would be the happiest? I propose that the happiest Sato competition has a few contenders, and one which realistically should be expelled based on a technical foul. Of course, it would be quite easy to say that the happiest Sato would be the one who, when on the Culture Festival roof, is approached by Hitomi, admits his feelings, and the whole situation is averted. That being said, we could move further than that back. Why wait for Hitomi to make the move and break up with her boyfriend? If he had said something in the literature club more generally, and was willing to engage, the same effect could probably be attained. The problem is Sato would probably be beaten by Hitomi's status boyfriend in this case, so cultural festival admission it is, I suppose. This is also basically the same if he admits to her on the final day when they have sex in the literature club room. The cyclic nature of their relationship really is something special, considering that episodes 11 through 13 is the reenacting of the Culture Festival. Episode 22 is the reenacting of the last day, with the conspiracy talk moving into the sexual, followed by a large expanse of time of them not meeting. This is not of any importance to our current consideration, but definitely interesting to note. I would suggest, however, that High School Sato should be expelled from this ranking on a technical foul. 1. We do not know the situations around Sato and Hitomi at that time as well as we do the current. As much as it is overwhelmingly likely that drowning in regret is not preferable, the time period in which it happened is so different to the time period in which our actual show occurs that commenting on it in the same light is nonsensical. It is much akin to asking, who would win a boxing match, Muhammad Ali or Tyson Fury, and getting the answer, well, Tyson Fury. Muhammad Ali is dead. High School Sato going back and actually making choices is out of the scope of our consideration. So, into the real contenders. I think the strongest contender is episode 9, at the fireworks festival with Mizaki. I said, during the play-by-play, that the end of episode 9 would be where a normal anime talking about overcoming regret would end, and I think that if that was the case, Sato and Mizaki would have a good chance at being happy. At that point, Mizaki has dedicated herself to Sato and his normal family, and Sato is being considerate of Mizaki. If the disastrous episode 10 did not invert Sato's progress, they would be nigh functional, almost the same as if they were at the end of the series with perhaps less trauma bonding and less physical injuries. Considering that Hitomi comes to him about her suicide after this point, there is still peril, but at least Sato would not have gone with them if he was already with Mizaki, and convinced the group to continue on to the suicide island when they had wavered. A more salient, rational, and backed by Mizaki Sato may have been more able to correctly perceive the struggles Hitomi was suffering in those moments, and, at least, the willing to engage Sato we see at the end of episode 9, I think, would have played cards with her. Alternatively, speaking of, if Sato had engaged with Hitomi when she came to his house, it is quite transparently stated that he could have talked her down from the metaphorical ledge and rolled back the years, finally able to combat his regret head-on if he hadn't wavered for so long pondering his regret as she sat in front of him waiting for any sort of response. I feel this Sato and Hitomi pairing would have issues relating to their sudden grouping. I don't think Jogasaki would care all that much, but Mizaki would be in quite dire need, and I am not quite sure how they provide support, but candidly, we know that Sato isn't stupid, and judging by her job, neither is Hitomi, so they should be able to figure out something. If Sato had confessed in episode 12 or 13, the weight placed on poor Mizaki as they chase after Sato immediately makes this more difficult, but I do believe the Sato and Hitomi pairing would be about the same, if a little peeved that it took this much to squeeze the words out of Sato. And finally, if it took all the way to episode 22 for Sato to say anything to Hitomi at those final moments, it would have been rough. That episode was a desperate attempt for Hitomi to get Sato to say anything, and failing terribly under the pure weight of Sato's lack of will to action. Alternatively, for Mizaki, if the New Year's shrine visit had went well, it would be roughly speaking fine, but the Sato we see at this stage of the show weighs heavy on Mizaki for support. There is, of course, one wild card, namely, the ending we actually see play out. It is the only one in which Sato gets to have at least a taste of the drama he wanted. We find out more about Mizaki, and we have a moment of definitive love from Sato to Mizaki wherein she can, as much as it's traumatizing in its own right, be fully sure that Sato does love her and value her. Sato, in this case, does actually have a job. As much as that's not really required in any of the prize situations, it's likely good for his self-worth, even though, in the light novel, his status of having a job does not, at the end of the story, make him believe himself any less of a freeter and a hikikomori. Further, his willingness to try in our actual ending is good, but that does also kind of happen in episode 9. If we're being honest, I do think that the end of episode 9, if Yamazaki hadn't been such an unbearable enabler, would have been the happiest possible ending, with episode 11 with Hitomi being a close second. After that though, the ending we actually see is a pretty good place for Sato and Mizaki in the context of the show. With this being said, I'd like to say that this dynamic is much of the greatness of the show. The ending is not depressing or edgy, nor is it outlandishly pleasant for the things we've seen Sato go through. It is an upper medium outcome without a hard resolution, leaving room for the future to be pleasant in its own right. As much as the ending isn't, per se, average and normal considering the 2 suicides which led up to it, it does set out roughly average expectations. They struggle, they suffer, and because they tried, things turned out in a broader sense better. Chapter 4. What can we learn from Takimoto? Welcome to the NHK is a tale about the will to continue and how to fuel that will, but more than that, it is not that in the slightest. It is not about anything, much in the style of No Longer Human. The meaning of the story evolved from the struggle Takimoto had writing it, with Welcome to the NHK beginning, as we find out from afterwards and most notably the hour-long anime lockdown interview, as a way for Takimoto to capitalise on his own shut-in status. The origins of the story are rooted in the prominence of NEET at the time, which was a new thing enabled by the existence of the phone and internet. Takimoto wagered that, with all these people experiencing the same iron will to stay inside that he had, a story relating to and about that disposition would sell well, and as the first afterword says, he'll go to Hawaii on the royalties. Takimoto then tells us that through the process of writing about a shut-in based on himself, as a shut-in, he more and more wrote about himself and became burdened by regret. Sato is early 2000s Takimoto inhabiting the world of fiction. Now is a great time to mention that I'll be doing a separate video going over the light novel and Rebuild as a follow-up to this video, but since they are not the same piece of media, in the absolute sense, they will only be used as useful references for this one. Please go pick those up to support Takimoto and follow his Instagram while you're at it at TatsuhikoTKMT. Takimoto further tells us, in Afterword 1, that it became a confessional piece, and that he got sucked up in the paranoid fantasies, believing that he too was being mocked and laughed at, saying that whenever he reread the story, he had hallucinations. He wanted to throw his computer out of his window, or run away to seclusion to avoid the mirror that he himself had written. He, depending on his mood, views Welcome to the NHK as either his magnum opus or an extreme failure. He finishes the afterword saying that he will continue to try hard. The second afterword is a significant departure in tone. Being more around the time of the anime's production, it begins with Takimoto telling us that he has not done his best, not writing even a single new story, reduced to a NEET living on the royalties for the past 4 years. Welcome to the NHK, ironically, gave Takimoto great paranoia about trying to write a new book, totally inhibiting him from even trying to do so. He now has a very positive view on the quality of the story, but is totally crippled by its existence. In 2016, however, we got a return of the man, writing a third afterword on his blog. He says that it had plagued him until recently still. He didn't want to write a realistic story. He wanted to write a story full of hopes and dreams, and that he finds the realistic ending quite cruel now, as we don't really have an answer to Sato's loneliness. At the same time saying that he didn't have the capacity to write a solution at the time, or even arguably now. He talks of ways for people to try to strive towards happiness, like meditation and others, and writes regretfully about, I perceive, how he treated the characters in the novel, which is foremost interesting because in this he feels bad about not giving himself a more open and transparently hopeful ending. He ends Forward 3 with a piece that I cannot say better than the man himself, so I will just read it. Sorry, Takimoto. Quote, I want to tell you, now, Sato, Mizaki, Yamazaki, and the senpai as well, they all succeeded in finding happiness in a happy ending. For sure, they have already found it. And with them, a new world has already begun. What I wanted to describe is not the weakness of men. Even in the labyrinth of a confused heart, no matter how a person may feel weakness and loss of energy, in the end it's possible to find a way out and rediscover herself. This is what I wanted to write. This conviction that I have not expressed while working on Welcome to the NHK, I write it now, and with this, my novel is finally complete. Unquote. Welcome to the NHK always comes with surprises, and this is another jump scare the first time reading. The tragedy of this even takes a while to settle in. As here we have our world Sato talk about how at the time he couldn't bring himself to write a fully happy ending to the novel, and it took him 14 years to get around to saying that his characters deserve a happy ending. Oddly, in this way, Takimoto's own inaction imparts suffering on the cast of the novel, and thusly back at himself as he is stricken down by his own novel. Takimoto goes into writing Welcome to the NHK wanting to write a hikikomori comedy, which becomes loosely based on his own life, and at around halfway through, it suddenly takes a nosedive into an exploration of the sadness of Sato, and therefore his own too. I do, however, find it eminently pleasant to read, from the author himself, who of course is currently writing Rebuild of Welcome to the NHK, that our cast do have happy endings. It is good to know that Sato and Mizaki have a good future together. Hitomi somehow finds happiness, probably in her child, and Yamazaki, or who knows, really likes milking cows. With this action, Takimoto, I am sure, unwittingly frees many of us from a bind we are put in with Welcome to the NHK. The ending is an outcome-realistic, vague anxiety with a glimmer of hope, so when Rebuild came around, people hoped for a sequel. But the sequel is right here in this blog update. We are permitted, with Takimoto, to believe in the path to happiness's existence. This is, first and foremost, important because Welcome to the NHK is a piece of media which affected many of its target audience greatly. Read around communities, openings and endings, and random reviews on YouTube and you'll find many people talking about the long-lasting positive effects of this novel on their will to action and their will to stop being a shut-in in order to not be like Sato. Secondly, of the other viewers, people who have some way to relate to the mental health and depressive struggles of the characters throughout the show and novel are also often impacted, and no less so than the shut-in demographic because of how human a tale Welcome to the NHK tells. For these two groups, and anyone asking for some sort of sequel, this paragraph acts as permission, even instruction, to move forward. I find that it is important to first talk about these afterwards before we fully dive into Takimoto as a writer, because they are connected to the story. The tale of Takimoto himself is a whole other beast. Welcome to the NHK was Takimoto's second book, with his first being Negative Happy Chainsaw Edge in 2001. While it did receive a live-action movie adaptation in 2007, Welcome to the NHK is by and large Takimoto's preeminent work. With pieces like Boku no Air, Isekai Nanpa, and even the collaborative Echo in the serialization of Faust, living in its all-consuming shadow. Negative Happy had its own success. It was popular enough to make Takimoto notable, but Welcome to the NHK's popularity was somewhat explosive, with a cover drawn by the illustrator of Serial Experiments Lane and a media circuit for Takimoto following its popularity. To this day, as far as I can tell and have read, the Japanese right-click translate sites consider him a one-hit wonder, but at least he is a wonder. Before the anime released, Takimoto, however, had already become a bit disillusioned with public appearances. You can, if you spend enough time going through 2chan, find ancient relic threads talking about Takimoto being attractive with enough right-clicking skills, and certainly, that did not help his most infamous move to date. In short, to put it in a way which is more approachable to a modern audience, Takimoto, in 2005, planned to hit a devious lick. He went on a TV broadcast on NHK2 on a show called BS Anime Talk, as his shy and typical self, with other cast members after the fact comparing him to a pleasant but frail creature after supposedly being told to be extra kind to him because he's mentally unwell. He decided, in that moment, to make some choice comments which one would not typically make on live television. The topic of the night was Evangelion, and Takimoto was, or is, a big fan of Evangelion. Firstly, he declared that in his mind, he is dating Rei Ayanami. Rei, as much as she is popular with anime enjoyers, is still 14, so this was a bit wild, especially considering he then, further, played his second hand of cards. When the topic of discussion moves on to Shinji's avoidance of the chaos going on around him, Takimoto claims that he admired Shinji's ability to definitively flee those issues, and then topped the entire cake by saying that the best scene in Evangelion is when Shinji, finding a comatose Asuka, drops his pretenses of wanting to be loved and becomes a being of pure hedonism, masturbating over her comatose form. Wonderful tea time entertainment. This caused uproar. 2chan for a while tried actively not talking about him, and Takimoto became less public, with the public viewing his quiet and withdrawn demeanour as suspicious, according to Nico Doga. As much as the cast seemed to have enjoyed Takimoto personally, the public was split between hating his opinions, hating his mannerisms, and a contingent of people finding him attractive. Supposedly, one of the hosts of BS introduced him to some fortune-telling cult, and he was wrapped up in that for a while and was in a relationship with a woman from that cult, or at least was cult-adjacent, in 2010 to 2012, and then was divorced and quit the cult over the course of 2012 to 2014, delving back into shut-in status from 2014 to 2016, and this is supposedly outlined in either the afterword of Boy of Mu or Boku no Air. I wouldn't know though, because neither of those have an English translation. I may try to find some way of acquiring a copy of these two to do some sleuthing for the follow-up, but currently, as it stands, I can't even really find a place to buy the Japanese versions. Either way, Takimoto was allowed to fade from public view to some extent, and this allowed him, once more, the social separation that he desired. In the time he was granted, he began to collate the parts of Boku no Air, only interrupted by the minor footnote of the creation of the anime of Welcome to the NHK, for which Takimoto was involved. He even later posted a picture of the 11th year reunion of the cast, which is nice. For Welcome to the NHK, Nikudoga tells us that Takimoto sent in lyrics to the composer, Kenji Otsuki. These lyrics comprised of just a list of words like wrist cut, charcoal briquette, suicide, suicide, which apparently the producer liked, but Otsuki was less interested. While collating, slowly, Boku no Air, Takimoto also would work on a collaborative piece called Faust. He had, by this point, had time to consider his situation and the public had somewhat calmed. There are gems, from Takimoto, hidden away in the counselling session section of Faust. I would recommend finding a way to read those in your own time. The Takimoto we get an insight into in those sections seems to be more autobiographical fiction, as the actions taken are reminiscent of the comedy of Welcome to the NHK. The interactions with his assistant, who only exists within his head, Asuka, which you may find amusing considering his comment about Rei, are genuinely funny. Takimoto wrestles in one of these pieces with the Japanese adage of, whenever someone poses a life decision, simply telling them to go to a soap land, which is a type of brothel-adjacent facility. Our author, in an act of avoidance, the first time tries to ignore the existence of such an adage, but on the second time, in further avoidance, dives fully into it, responding to every question after himself going to a soap land with, "Go to a soap land," until his assistant, Asuka, tells him that these are women asking for advice. This feels like Sato writing as Takimoto does about Sato, but about Takimoto. This time the assistant carries the Kierkegaardian twist of do or do not, you'll regret both, and has to pummel the go to a soapland out of Takimoto. The short piece of autofiction hidden within Faust, at one of the moments where Takimoto is still fully in the throes of Welcome to the NHK's power over him, writes about the message of Welcome to the NHK, the Kierkegaardian aspect, and, as Asuka says, if you make a decision, quote, "No matter what mistakes you make or regrets you have, there will be a bright future waiting for you someday. But first, just do it yourself." Unquote. While not being able to really, truly appreciate that for himself. The worst part about it is, it's basically just Welcome to the NHK again at lightning speed in a comedic light. Further, we get some insight into Takimoto's philosophical readings, as we get a mention of Christian philosopher William James, so we can assume that he's probably at least referentially absorbed information about Kierkegaard. Faust ultimately gives us a look at what Takimoto's post-NHK years were like. The Takimoto we get to read is funny, quietish, anxious, but mostly still held by the pin of Welcome to the NHK. He, in 2009, seems healthier than in 2005, but we know with the power of hindsight that he is about to, in 2010, join a cult, or at least be cult peripheral. There is little direct news about his time in the cult, but it is possible that, as much as the cult tried to get him more involved, there are reports that he was too reclusive to really be wrapped up too much in the actual activity of the cult. I can find one mention of Takimoto going to an actual public fortune-telling, but other than that, his appearance seems sparse. Faust also gives us the following comedic insight about Takimoto as he supposedly ventures to the soapland, trying to lower his anxiety before having to interact with this quote. Quote, "As long as I opened with a funny joke like that one, everything else was sure to go smoothly. I always carry a joke notebook with me so I can write down all my excellent jokes." Unquote. Considering the show, the themes, the inclusion of Dazai, my only real commentary on Takimoto's self-reflection here is, makes sense. Takimoto then falls off the face of the earth for a long time, gets caught up with a weird cult which, on the way back machine, you will find talking about how Hitler had mystic predictions in an article after Takimoto had left, and then, in 2015, we see his re-emergence begin with his blog. He returned more in 2016, cautiously, and then in 2018, we begin to see the emergence of the Takimoto we have now. He is still, somewhat at least, molded by his experiences of meditation and religiosity, incorporating some of that into Rebuild in a comedic way, but he has, for the most part, come out of the trenches he put himself in. He gets to comment online about his prior writings, he gets to be excited about his new projects, and finally, lockdown hits and everyone has to live the way he did for so long. Takimoto, at this point, gives regular updates on his writing to a comfortably sized audience and seems to be doing better. We see him do an hour-long interview with Anime Lockdown wherein we are told the rest of the NHK crew, other than Sato, were added to spice up his alternate world life without any real models to base them on. And we get some context around Rebuild and some of his other works too. It's just pleasant. We see someone who we know has had 20 years of public suffering now get to have a light chuckle. Of course, in the afterword of Rebuild Chapter 1, we found out that writing Rebuild was a far more daunting task than he first imagined. He had initially thought that, since he had already finished Welcome to the NHK once and fought those demons, updating Welcome to the NHK for clarity in a modern setting would be easy, or at least easier, maybe even cathartic. This was not the case, as he quickly found himself becoming a shut-in once more. The curse of Welcome to the NHK had returned for him, vomiting and crying if he tried to do more than a few sentences of writing each day. Finally, he powered through it, and we find ourselves here in the modern day, with 5 chapters of Rebuild published, and 4 of them translated to English. This leads into the next point. 4 of them are translated, and that makes 1 more volume published than there are reviews on Welcome to the NHK Rebuild Part 4. I am one of 3 people to leave a review on Part 4's English translation. I am sure, because of his Twitter updates informing us so, that the Japanese market for his magazine it is serialized in Elites is vastly healthier than the English sales, but that being said, the tragedy of something as promising and captivating as Rebuild, which, at the time of writing, as one of 3 reviewers, I can confirm is extremely good, only having 3 reviews is agony. Considering how many links I have to reference for this piece are only accessible through the Wayback Machine and also requiring translating from Japanese to English with Google Translate, I also came to the realization that I did not have time to put off this script. One of the sources I was using for the initial draft of this video disappeared into the ether as I was writing it, and because at the time the draft was just pinned tabs in a notepad, I do not know where it has gone, nor the information therein. There had been some talk on Takimoto's Twitter about Rebuild getting a publisher, which I hope comes true, as, honestly, spending almost €40 to buy the book in chapters has been an experience. But more than that, I hope for its continuing success as an art piece on the face of that value. The obscurity of the history of the show will inevitably make the next me, who watches the show and wants to know more about the author and the Dazai-style path the book takes alongside him, have a harder time appreciating the wacky backstory if they can at all, and that, I believe, is the importance of this video and why it is so long. Chapter 5. Conclusionary Notes and Comparisons. Now that we have ventured through the history and context of Welcome to the NHK, I think it's important to, in conclusion, consider the uniqueness of the introspective autofiction contained. Welcome to the NHK is famously hard to compare to other things, with most anime suggested as nearest neighbours being, all in all, not that similar. Watamote, for example, is often put as the nearest neighbour, but it basically only shares a shut-in adjacent setting and a character with social anxiety. 2020's Sing Yesterday for me is similar, kind of. Strip Welcome to the NHK of its pacing and exploration of deeper struggles of the characters involved, and you get something looking like the love triangle between avoidant people we see in Sing Yesterday for me. I'd venture to say that it's the closest anime to Welcome to the NHK, but I would further say that there are pieces of media more sharing in the feel and soul of Welcome to the NHK. There are moments within Steins Gate, where we get a hint of Welcome to the NHK's DNA, and equally, within Welcome to the NHK, we have the DNA of course, Dazai is no longer human. Goodnight Pun Pun has moments of similarity, but a comparison of the two falls apart given the framing and characters herein. No Longer Human, in a lot of respects, has similar aspects to Welcome to the NHK, including plot points. The character of Yozu has, equally, an avoidance of human interaction, and an avoidant demeanour in general, instead using his surface-level charm to manoeuvre the world. Where Sato is terrified of the judgment contained within rejection and being viewed, Yozu cannot bear the idea of disappointing or denying someone else because of the potential consequences a human could enact. Instead, Yozu takes the route of a funny guy, and in the course, strings along women and through his inauthentic personal relations, causes suffering. Sato, of course, is more direct. He simply outright does not interact. And I do believe that the relatability of someone simply not acting out of fear of being embarrassed or looked down on is greater than that of someone like Yozu, who is distant from the idea of human emotion and is therefore terrified of it. No Longer Human is another work of autobiographical fiction, but I'd venture to say that the two, if we had to compare them, are a genre mismatch. We get different end goals out of the two pieces. No Longer Human portrays a gloomy view of the human condition and is ultimately a story about suffering, where Welcome to the NHK views suffering as a medium towards telling the story of keeping on, while being able to strive towards the human while considering the negatives of avoidance. An unlikely contender for nearest neighbour is, oddly, The Office UK, with David Brent's abject failure and bone-chilling cringe being oddly Sato-like. But much like Welcome to the NHK, the side characters do not get off easily either. The feel, in parts, is very similar, but obviously the setting differs wildly. These two, however, function as the best match for the mirror quality of Welcome to the NHK, wherein one can easily see themselves in whatever character they are perceiving. One may relate to Sato's avoidance, his moments of inaction, and one may further relate to David Brent's confidently incorrect social interaction. The problem with the aforementioned comparisons, other than No Longer Human, is that they are all, for lack of a better term, stories. They are, where No Longer Human and Welcome to the NHK are works of autobiographical fiction, and hence blur the line, instead, works of real fiction told as an entertainment medium. I would further like to briefly talk about how Kanye West has several tracks, like Runaway, which generally orbit the same feeling of autofictional continuing regret. Comparing the two is difficult, but I, as a Welcome to the NHK enjoyer, get a lot of the same experience listening to some select Kanye tracks that I do out of rewatching Welcome to the NHK, and I think this feeling of the autofictional observation of one's own self-destruction warrants at least Runaway to be in this comparison. I feel it also important, then, to talk about how good the understated score for Welcome to the NHK is. Damn It, Another Sunset and Hitori Bochi are both notably great, and really capture the feeling of Welcome to the NHK. The slow, melancholy contemplation is distilled in Another Sunset, and Hitori Bochi feels like regret. The other music for the show is also very good, and different to other shows' music selection. The type of music Welcome to the NHK went with further separates it from other comparable pieces of media. Puzzle, too, is a work of art of an opening, following Another Sunset in having a malleable feel to the audio package. At first listen, either of them sound generally quite pleasant and enjoyable, but with context, they begin to contain the experience of the show. To consider, then, Welcome to the NHK as sort of an enigma isn't hard. It can be hard to watch, it can be off-putting with its content, but ultimately it will try to engage with you on a human front. It portrays a believable character in a realistic setting, and, as much as it is likely to leave you feeling sad or something akin to sad, it doesn't mean to. It intends to be jovial and simply slips into despair with the audience, which I think really sets it apart as a piece of media. The end effect of expressing that sadness isn't fully intended, but instead a consequence of the conversation one has through reading or watching with the author or director. Welcome to the NHK is beautiful, tragic, heartbreaking, relatable, funny, enheartening, utterly dejecting, and packs a message which boils down to, at its base, keep going and do things. Try to make a life you want to live in whatever form that looks like. Welcome to the NHK is often accused of being directed at shut-ins, like Watamote, but while that may have been where the story originated, the story's display of all walks of life struggling with the human condition through the eyes of a shut-in can give insights or at least be related to by almost any demographic. And now, as we come to the end of our trip through Ikuta, I do hope that this exploration of the history, intricacies, and message of Welcome to the NHK has been rewarding or insightful in some way. With the content of this video drawing to a close, I would be so brash as to declare my own opinion. The streamer Ludwig's declaration that Welcome to the NHK is his favourite anime was a moment of elation. Not that I particularly watch live streams or Ludwig's content in general, but the appreciation of this introspective art piece was encouraging. I do, however, have to differ from Ludwig. Welcome to the NHK is not my favourite anime of all time. Welcome to the NHK is, when we're talking in terms of all time, in my opinion, the singular best piece of media, visual or otherwise.